what you had was a belligerent occupation by the British to deny the Palestinians their right to self-determination for the purpose of facilitating the Zionist project to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state.
You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Lovett.
Yes, Rachel, you are listening to that great podcast in the sky, And If Love Remains, and I am its messenger, Mike Levitt, the blind Rabbi Micah, calling for the four horsemen of the WWW to reveal that thinning veneer of the death cult that we call the state. And we're so glad that you can join us on this journey. If I was Richard Branson, I'd talk about this light that is beaming on us like the sun, like a spiritual sun that is, awakening us with just a touch of Marxism, Richard. You've got a touch of Marxism in you, but that's all right. We love you anyway. I am very, very excited to have a returning guest, Jeremy R. Hammond. You can find him at jeremyrhammond.com. His website's phenomenal. Excellent information. He's a journalist. He's what we quaintly call a journalist, but he does what actual journalists are supposed to do, which is he exposes state propaganda that is serving to manufacture consent for criminal government policies. If only there were more of you, Jeremy. But I'm glad that you've got a market there for that kind of content. Welcome back to the show, man.
Thanks for having me on again. Great to see you again.
Absolutely. Hey, by the way, and I got this wrong, so I'm going to get it right. Your latest book, is that the War on Informed Consent? Is that the latest book that you have put out?
Yeah, the latest book that's in print.
It's in print.
I have a number of ebooks. I create these ebooks that I give away with my, to subscribers of my newsletter. But yeah, the latest real book, so to speak, is the War on Informed Consent.
Fantastic. And although we're gonna delve into the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and you've done a lot of just tremendous work on that. I know that's been a focus of your study for a long time. You have incredible articles on the COVID propaganda and the things that we went through during the COVID things, and all kinds of things I think liberty-minded people would be very interested in. So again, I just highly recommend go to jeremyrhammond.com and check out his info there. Jeremy, I had you on before, and because I discovered you doing a debate on the Tom Woods show about a month or so ago, and it was just a wonderful debate, and I really appreciated how you conducted yourself and how you presented your information. And I learned a lot from it. But we kind of jumped right in last time, but I didn't kind of get your origin story, and I'm curious about how you got into doing what you do. What made you want to become a journalist, and kind of take me through kind of your process of writing and what how you came to do it.
Yeah, well, it was really the events of 9/11 that kind of triggered my desire to kind of just learn more and educate myself more, because I happened to have I had graduated from college, didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I have a degree in film and video, a communications degree, but I didn't really want to move to New York or LA to get involved in the film industry or anything like that. I'm a small town guy, grew up in the woods. I just wasn't what I wanted. I realized it wasn't what I wanted to do with my life, and I'm like, why did I just spend all this time like getting this BS degree? So I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I ended up, I had a friend who had been to Taiwan, and he kind of encouraged me. He said, I'm going back in the fall. Why don't you come with me? We'll go and we'll teach English for a while and, figure things out. So that was what I planned on doing. I had bought my plane ticket like 2 weeks before 9/11, and then arrived in Taiwan shortly after the events. And it just was asking myself the question, the naive question, like, why would people do this? And just being dissatisfied with Bush's answer that that they hate our freedoms, and that didn't make any sense to me. So I started researching, and I was just kind of like naive and not knowing the answer already. But
Now, did you grow up political at all, or did you grow up kind of looking out at the world and listening to hosts? And did you grow up in that, or was this kind of new for you?
Not particularly. I would describe my knowledge of world events and history and current events and things as probably considerably above average in terms of the population. But it wasn't a particular focus of mine or anything like that. It was just it was really kind of I kind of was just unaware of a lot of government interventions overseas, and just the history of interventions, particularly what the U.S. was doing in the Middle East. And so that really became an intense focus of mine, researching the events of 9/11 first, and then coming to realize how we'd been lied to about the events of that day, which we could discuss if you'd like. And then that kind of, by the end of 2002, it became clear to me that they were using the events of 9/11 as a pretext to invade Iraq. And so I started just like sending emails home to friends and family. I was in Taiwan there again at that time. Um, and I was just there. I taught English for a while there, and I was teaching English at the time. And I was sending like emails home of information about how the government was lying,
Right.
to try to lying about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, WMD operative ties to Al Qaeda. Uh,
Yeah.
so they had all these lies that they were creating this pretext to launch a war, an illegal war of aggression for the purpose of regime change, which had been pre-planned. I mean, the regime change had been an idea of the neocons long predating the events of 9/11. And it was kind of a really educational experience for me, in the sense that like nobody wanted to hear the information I was sending them.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you. So, because to me, it's fascinating that took place while you're in Taiwan, and I'm curious, like how much of an influence that was as far as like being able to get true information. We were so propagandized here, and I remember it so clearly. About what was going on. It was very difficult to have a dissident voice here in America. So, tell me what was that experience like for you to
Yeah.
get information and try to get to the bottom of things?
Yeah, well, I think that was a big factor. Is just like I was kind of outside of the U.S. propaganda system. I wasn't getting my news or information anymore from watching the TV news in the evenings. I really discovered the internet for the first time, where I was like really made use of it, and just researched and getting my information from a huge variety of sources,
Right. Not
as
just Matt
opposed to maybe
Drudge.
a handful of like U.S. media companies. It's like, I'm getting my information from Al Jazeera, from Israeli Haaretz, from the Jerusalem Post, from the BBC, from Russian, the Russian newspapers, English speaking ones, or, just
Yeah.
like English language newspapers from all over the world, and just getting such a huge variety of sources. And so just not limiting, my from the source of my information to like U.S. Uh, media corporations. So that by itself was just a huge factor. And then you had all kinds of great content aggregators back then, which still are actually around today. Tom Feely's Information Clearinghouse, I would go there, or what really happened .com was another one, where you had these guys just kind of like, I don't know how they managed to consume so much information in a day, but they would like compile all these just like dozens and dozens of great articles on really important information that you just were not getting anywhere else from the mainstream media, and you could go there and just kind of get information that you wouldn't get elsewhere, from just a huge variety of sources. So there was those types of informational sites that I was getting from information from, and just like Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector. You could go on, and I managed to find online there where you could go read reports from the UN weapons inspectors during the 90s. And it was this type of information that I was sending home and showing, like, look, here's what the weapons inspectors were saying. Here's what the US government is saying. Now you try to reconcile those two things, and tell me how it isn't the case that the US government is brazenly, blatantly lying.
Right.
They're brazenly lying. And we know that. We know that. And so it wasn't like it, but I got called a conspiracy theorist. I was anti-American. I was pro Saddam for not
Yeah.
like getting behind this war effort. And it was really shocking to me that I was just presenting like factual information, clearly showing that, number one, they had no evidence. I mean, you could look at the evidence that they claimed, but you could show how that evidence was just, they were like the aluminum tubes, which they said were supposed to be for uranium enrichment centrifuges.
Yeah.
But you could go and see these experts commenting, experts in like centrifuges, and how they're saying like, well, you couldn't even use these tubes for that purpose. They're not built for that. They're for they're for making artillery to launch rockets. They're those type of tubes. They're not for
Right.
centrifuges, and you couldn't even use them for that purpose without extensive retooling. And so you had like these experts commenting on these types of things, but they were, like the real experts were just being completely sidelined and ignored in favor of this propaganda narrative that Saddam Hussein is trying to enrich, build these tubes to enrich uranium to weapons
Hmm.
grade so it can acquire nuclear weapons. It's got nuclear weapons programs. It's got active chemical and biological warfare programs. None of this was true, and they had no real evidence for any of it, and all the evidence was concocted, and you could demonstrably show that they were concocting the evidence. And so, long before, like months and months, again, this goes back to 2002.
Yeah.
The war started in March 2003, and so I was saying there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction back, well before the war, well before, because of course there was this propaganda narrative that shifted after the war. Of course, they invaded and they found no weapons of mass destruction, and even the CIA had to finally admit that, it looks like everything really was the weapons program did end in 1991 when the UN basically finished destroying any remaining stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, which Saddam did used to have, but that was during the 80s when the U.S. was supporting him and providing him with the
With the means to get the
means to be able to create those weapons. When they said that Saddam gassed his own people. Well, that was in 1988 when the U.S. was supporting him.
Right. It's oh man. I think it's I think of the parallelism of the even the Israeli conflict today, where where the Israel's like, yeah, we know there's tunnels there because we built them, and it's the same thing. Like, yeah, we know they had chemical weapons because we gave it to them.
Yeah, the U.S. provided precursors for Saddam's chemical and biological weapons, and so. So by the time that they rolled around to this propaganda campaign, it was a campaign of deliberate disinformation. And then they had to cover that up after they finally admitted, the government had to admit that, we were wrong. There were no weapons of mass destruction. So they invented a new propaganda narrative to whitewash the original propaganda narrative, and they called it an intelligence failure.
Right.
So this is, again, a myth. There was no intelligence failure. There was a deliberate campaign of disinformation. And it was within the U.S. intelligence establishment, where the intelligence establishment would sideline its own, like its own experts. Like you had experts from the Department of Energy, who are the experts
Right.
in nuclear energy and centrifuges and all that. And they would be saying, no, you can't use these tubes these tubes are not for that purpose. And Central Intelligence would basically ignore the analysis of the top experts in the country on centrifuges in favor of pipelining into the White House, information from a single analyst named Joe, who put together this whole case for why there were centrifuges. It was a bunch of nonsense. And so you can see how, because of course, it's a simple logical truism that if you're going to feed the White House information it wants, that's going to be good for your career.
Yeah.
Whereas if you feed the White House information it doesn't want to see, that's probably not going to be very good for your career. And so you have this kind of incentive within the community to create propaganda. And it's the same with the Health Freedom issue and
Yep.
science, and people wonder, well, how can it be that the entire medical establishment can be wrong? Well, because you look at the science and how corrupt it is,
That's right.
and where does the
You know,
funding come from? And when
all the money.
it's simple. Like scientists who will produce conclusions and study findings that the CDC wants and the FDA wants and the U.S. government wants, and which of course they all work for the pharmaceutical companies. So if you produce results that entire establishment wants, you're going to probably have a pretty good career. But if you produce results that are contrary to public policy, well, guess what? That's not really good, very good for your career. It's the same within the intelligence community, and this is what happened. Um, and so you had the
Now,
CIA
a
kind of,
question though,
yeah,
just because I mean, maybe you're getting here, but my one of the things that um I guess I wonder about is like motivation, like what was the why Saddam, why then, why was that important? I've heard everything from because he was going off the dollar standard to we had to we were doing it for Israel, another kind of one of those tropes, which may or may not. I just don't know the motivation of why Saddam, why then.
yeah. I think those are all factors. I mean, you had the U.S. dollar hegemony is a major factor. And the sale of the petrodollar system, where the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and largely propped up through oil sales in dollars. And Iraq was threatening that system, selling oil and non-dollar currencies, which is a sin Iran had committed as well down the road. So that was one factor, where it was just Saddam. And then you can go back and read the policy documents, like from the Project for a New American Century, the PNAC, the neocon think tank, and where they talk
And
openly
that, and by the way,
about
that's the other thing that's the other thing that I'd forgotten about is the idea of how do we keep, now that the Soviet Union's gone, how do we keep America as this monolithic empire for as
right.
long as we can for the next century or two?
Right. Yes. Yes. It was really all. It was very much about empire, and so they needed some kind of external threat, and which is of course where 9/11 came in the pretext of we have this war on terrorism that we have to fight, and Iraq became part of that. Because like you said, yeah, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we needed a new enemy. I mean, it's very much like Orwell's 1984.
Oh,
Who are
I'm
we
telling
fighting
you,
today?
you can draw a line. I mean, I think you can draw a line, and you don't have to be too creative in doing that. From the fall of the Soviet Union to 9/11 to the war on terror, to a bunch of
The
small
COVID.
proxy or to COVID, right? To COVID, to Ukraine, to Israel. Like it doesn't take. You don't have to have a maze to get through that line of thinking there, and it's honestly quite frustrating. This is why people like Assange is still in jail, and it's absolutely criminal. And this is if there's one reason why nobody should ever vote for Donald Trump or anybody like is because he did not free Julian Assange. It's that is a absolute yeah, that dude's a hero, man. And it's impossible to say like, and this is why I appreciate what you're doing because you didn't build the infrastructure that Assange did, but you're doing that same kind of work of trying to expose the truth of what's happening and man, it
Yeah,
needs to happen more
the persecution of Julian Assange has tremendous implications for the practice of journalism,
for sure.
because that's what he was doing. He was doing journalism, but really of a unique quality and type. Um, but that, I mean, he was exposing U.S. war crimes in Iraq, for instance, and for that he's just been relentlessly persecuted by the U.S. government. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just horrific. Yeah, certainly.
What now where do you fall to go back to 9/11? Where do you fall on the from the research that you've done, you know, um was it a pre-planned, drone planes from the military that knocked those towers down, all the way to it was a useful terrorist action that we used. That we were waiting for something like this to happen to use as a pretext to go to war. Where do you fall kind of in that line?
Well, let's start with what's uncontroversial. They had
Okay.
foreknowledge.
Yeah.
They lied about that. They said that they had no idea that something like this could happen. Well, just the previous month, in August of 2001, Bush had a brief from the CIA saying, that Osama bin Laden determined to attack the U.S. And of course, the obvious target was the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center had already been attacked. What was it? I think it was 1993.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, in that attack, the FBI had an informant in the cell, and they had a plan to replace the bomb. They were going to try to create a dud by replacing some of the ingredients and the workings of the bomb that they were building. And for whatever reason, and the informant came out, and there was a recording of him saying this and admitting how the FBI had pulled him off of that and said, no, allow them to proceed with the operation. So there's a curiosity. And a lot of this stuff was like reported in like the New York Times, and you can read about the stuff and like, this isn't like conspiracy theory stuff. It's like mainstream type news, but then it just kind of, it gets tossed down the memory hole. Right.
Right.
Which I learned very early on, like when I read important articles, like to save them because
get hard,
like
print them
stuff
out.
would disappear. Like stuff would literally disappear from the internet.
Wow.
Back then, and now it's easier to access stuff. But you have Internet Archive and different tools like that. But I remember back then, like I would like start saving articles because I would notice them start disappearing. But anyhow, yeah. So it's uncontroversial that they had foreknowledge of the attacks. They knew that it was an operation in the planning. The CIA was tracking. What is it? I forget their names. Al Madar and the other guy in Asia.
Yeah,
who had gone to. They were tracking two of the terrorists, and they deliberately allowed them into the U.S. They deliberately allowed them into the U.S., and then they didn't notify State Department, Immigration, FBI like they should have. They went, and then they moved into an apartment with an FBI informant. Like they were literally living in the apartment of renting from an FBI informant.
I mean, this sounds like the governor of Michigan's, pretty close. Other than it sounds like the FBI had more willing participants for 9/11.
Yeah, and there was I don't know if you recall this information, like the Israeli spy ring that was uncovered in the U.S., where it appeared that they were monitoring some of the terrorists, tracking their movements.
Wow.
A lot of people took a logical leap and then concluded that Israel was involved. I don't. The evidence doesn't go that far. The evidence did indicate that. The point is that intelligence knew about the plot. They knew about it. Israeli intelligence seemed to know. In fact, I think Israeli intelligence warned the U.S. intelligence. There was clear foreknowledge. You had foreknowledge. People, offices in the towers. The Israeli. There was a Israeli communications company that was warned to get out.
So is that where all is it that kind of thing where a lot of rumors came that like a bunch of Jewish people were not there at work that day and had foreknowledge? Is it like you had these companies that were specifically Israeli companies that were warned?
Yeah, and this tied into was a Fox News report by a guy named Carl Cameron. It's a 4-part series that he did on the Israeli spy ring that got broken up in the U.S. And he talks about how like these Israeli companies were responsible for all these communication systems in the U.S. that the U.S. intelligence community relies on, and all the evidence indicating that Israeli intelligence had its own back door into the U.S. intelligence communications network, and into the White House, and they described past incidences of where it was apparent that essentially Israeli intelligence was monitoring U.S. intelligence.
Which makes sense. I mean, we all spy on each other. I mean, to me, like that's obvious that that's going to happen,
Right.
but
And then you had
that
the dancing Israelis. That there were these the 4 or 5 Israeli guys who were seen,
I don't
and
remember
actually they
this.
were arrested. They were filming the burning towers and like celebrating, like dancing around like at the site of the towers burning. And I think I think that's been misinterpreted. I think that I don't want to speculate too much, but so that you can understand why these kind of like conspiracy theory about Israel being involved, right? Because there's a lot of true information there. But again, to draw that conclusion is kind of a leap of logic. I think
Yeah,
I think
you're saying that they knew about it because they were along with the U.S. and if not a joint operation, at least at least they were looking at the operation of the U.S. following these terrorists and seeing what they were doing and knew that there was a plot. Now, do you think they knew that? I guess they did. They were the ones that warned them, so they knew that it was against the World Trade Center, that it was going to happen on that day. I mean, that's pretty remarkable to think about. Um,
yeah,
it's quite
I think they
sobering.
I think they had I think that the evidence of foreknowledge is very broad and deep. So it's very clear they had foreknowledge. They knew that there was a plot,
So then the
and the
question
obvious
is that,
target for that plot would have been the World Trade Center.
and they obviously let it happen. So the question is, did they let it? I mean, there's a couple of reasons why you would let something happen. You would let something happen because you don't want to give up your sources, right? Like, so maybe you let small things happen so you can maintain the integrity of your spying. You can let things happen because you're getting more bad guys than good guys. I mean, I can think of about 3 or 4 reasons, but one of the reasons why you would let things happen is because it serves your own global purposes.
Right.
And is that kind of the case that you're making?
Yes. And the neocons were quite open about using 9/11 as a quote unquote opportunity to push forth their pre-planned agenda, um, for global hegemony, including regime change in Iraq, and they had plans on Syria, Iran. I mean,
Right.
they wanted to transform the Middle East, and this ties
Which
into
Nikki
again
Haley
with
is still trying to
Israel
do.
back in the first Netanyahu government. The first time he was in power, you had neocons writing. There was a clean break document that they had written for the Netanyahu government, describing this transformation of the Middle East to serve Israel's interests. And so this goes into the question: what are the motives?
Right.
They were interested. They're all a bunch of Zionists, of course, and so they were interested in overthrowing Saddam's regime in Iraq, dollar hegemony, serve Israel's interests,
Sure.
to put someone in power who's more compliant with U.S. policy, more friendly to the U.S. Quite a lot of different, obviously oil and just his production of oil. They wanted to get someone in there who wasn't willing to use oil as a weapon, as a policy tool, to try kind of like withholding supplies and things when the U.S. didn't appreciate his policies of selling oil and non-dollar currencies, things like this. It was really about hegemony. It also served Israel's interests, which was kind of I don't think that was the main reason. A lot of people think that was it was fought for Israel, but they were really clear. I mean, you can go back and read their policy documents. They were very clear about having what they saw as U.S. interests, of course, narrowly defined by themselves, not by
Mhm.
us.
Right.
Certainly didn't serve our interests as
No,
the American
no.
people, but in their mind, they had very clear what they considered to be U.S. interests that were primary, and I think the fact that it served Israel's interests as well, at least in their calculations, I think was secondary. So I don't agree that it was fought for Israel, but certainly they made clear themselves how the overthrow of Saddam would benefit Israel.
Okay.
Um,
And
and
is that the kind of what led you to doing a deep dive into the history of Israel and Palestine, or was there another trigger for that?
Well, it was really, again, coming back to 9/11, I was asking myself the question, why would they do this? And Saddam, sorry, not Saddam, Osama bin Laden,
Yeah.
rather, He put out that letter, the letter to America, that was recently like viral on TikTok or something,
Right.
where like this new generation of people, kids these days, like they weren't around then, so they didn't know about it. But
Yep.
of course, I remember reading that back in 2002 when it was first published, where he's explaining like these are our grievances against the United States. You've got your military bases in our holy, in Saudi Arabia. We don't want you there.
Right.
You've got the history of U.S. interventionism, harmful U.S. interventionism throughout the Middle East, and a primary grievance was U.S. support for Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. And so, I couldn't like not ask myself the question, why would they do this, and not look into U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East? And if I'm going to do that, you can't not look into U.S. policy in Israel-Palestine conflict. And of course, I had other kind of just background that kind of led me to be interested in the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular, just because, I was raised in a Christian family. So I was brought up as a Christian. I remember going to Sunday school. And when you're brought up in that environment, you're always hearing people say things like, we must support Israel no matter what, because, among Christians, there really is a very strong Christian Zionist movement.
Yeah.
It's
Like that, I think
very
you make
rare
a
to
good
find like
you make
Christians who are anti-Zionist.
yeah, I think you make a pretty good case. I've heard you make that Christian Zionism is really predates Jewish Zionism,
Oh, it does.
as a modern idea.
Yeah, it predates like yes, modern political Zionism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Christian Zionism does, and so you're always hearing things like that, and obviously just it's the Holy Land, right? So if you come up from that background, of course you're already kind of already focused on that. You hear about these places, you hear about like Bethlehem, and you read about it in the Bible, and that's Palestine. Bethlehem's in the West Bank. So I already kind of had this just from my background and upbringing, this curiosity and interest in the region, for that historical purpose. And then once I wanted to start doing research into U.S. foreign policy, it just became kind of a natural focus, which I kind of emphasize because you always get asked the question, well, why do you focus on Israel? Are you anti-Semitic? They have this stupid, like if you criticize Israel, like somehow that
Right.
Israel is unique.
So if I criticize Biden, does that make me anti-American?
Well, that's what I always say, that's like the same thing when I got called anti-American for being against the Iraq war. Or, you get called pro-Hamas if you're against Israel's genocide in Gaza right now.
Does that mean like
you're pro-Hamas? I was pro-Saddam.
Very conservative Jewish people who don't believe in Zionism are now anti-Semitic. Like the logic doesn't follow.
No, because of course it's anti-intellectual and it's moral cowardice to level the accusation. And of course there is real anti-Semitism, but to level that accusation at people who are legitimately criticizing Israel's policies is just the height of intellectual dishonesty. And so of course I've weathered that accusation ever since I first started writing about this topic. And it just obviously it bothers me, but it doesn't affect me. Like I'm not going to let that silence me. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because it's a tool to try to silence critics.
Right.
And of course I don't let that silence me. So that people can level these accusations. It's the same as like, oh, you're an anti-vaxxer, you're anti-science,
right?
Because you respect the right to informed consent. It's that level of anti-intellectualism.
And to me, like again, we talk. I mentioned like a short line between things. To me, it's really frustrating when you hear the same people that criticized the vaccine plot, that criticized the pharmaceutical companies, that criticized the Ukraine war, have all of a sudden switched on Israel. And it is a religious fervor that this happens on, and it's very difficult to kind of yank that off of them.
Yeah, it's my audience has shifted a lot over the years. When I started out just focused on foreign policy, If people would assume I was like a left winger or something because I was
Right.
critical of U.S. foreign policy, and I would be called a leftist and things. And then when, like during COVID, people assume you're right wing or something. You must
Right.
support Trump if you're like against, I don't know. People have these
You're
crazy
probably
ideas. As
you're probably homeschooled, Jeremy,
Yeah, well, we do homeschool, as a matter of
See?
fact. I wasn't homeschooled, but we
Right.
homeschool our son precisely because I learned
Yeah.
how much I was lied to
Yeah.
in the government education that I got, which is part of the problem.
For
Um,
sure.
but it's so my audience has kind of shifted I've had quite a flight actually from my subscriber list, my newsletter.
I was going to ask you, like, tell me about that. Like, have you seen, like, what are, you don't have to go into the detailed numbers, but kind of give me a sense of the pushback that you've gotten from, people walking.
Yeah, it's kind of I think now most of the people who just don't want to hear what I have to say have kind of already left my mailing list. But when I first shifted, I mean, from October 7th and
Mm-hmm.
the Hamas atrocities in Israel on October 7th till now, I mean, I've done nothing but focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict again, such as I had in the past. But for many years, I mean, it had been several years. I was really focused entirely on vaccines, and then of course the COVID lockdown madness with its coerced mass vaccination endgame. And that was the focus. Like
Yeah.
at Ukraine, I in the past I would have been very much focused on what was going on in Ukraine, but I had no bandwidth for it whatsoever
Yeah.
because I was so focused on still just fighting the lockdown insanity and the medical tyranny at home that I couldn't pay much attention to it. As much as I would have liked to have known more about what's going on and writing about that.
Well, and it is different, and this kind of proves the kind of isolationist point that a lot of uh, uh, old conservatives or libertarians have of, like, we got to take care of ourselves and our families first. Those are our priorities, and anything outside of that, we need to leave alone.
Yeah,
Because
becoming a father
we don't have
changed.
the bandwidth.
Yeah, once I became a father, and we were having to make choices about
Yeah.
for our own son, about vaccines, and so I started kind of applying my journalistic skills and research skills that I had gained to that question and going into the medical literature for myself. And it was kind of like once I kind of acquired the knowledge and I could see I had anticipated there to be a difference between what we're told and
Right.
what's in the science, but the chasm that I found between what we're told science says and what science actually has to say about it was so broad and deep and just like unbridgeable that I realized, like, okay, I have to speak out about this issue. I have to start writing about this issue. And in time, I think probably by 2017 or 2018, that's like pretty much all I was writing about anymore. And so that's why when COVID hit in 2020, I
Oh,
was
so
publishing
okay,
it.
hold on a second. Because I think I didn't understand that. So you're telling me, like, you were kind of on the vaccine trail of things, when your child was born, which you mentioned, that your child's 4-ish. So if 2017, 2018, you were already talking about, like, hey, we got to watch out for these things. Like, this is not good for our bodies. We need to,
Yeah,
and then COVID hit. So it wasn't the other way
right.
around. Like, for me,
No,
it was the other way around.
no, I was well prepared to focus on COVID already because of
Wow.
I was already deep into the literature, following the science, learning how to read scientific studies
What a blessing.
on medical issues. So it was just kind of a natural. I just fell into that immediately because it was just already I was already focused on health freedom because my son was born in 2012, and it was a number of years of intense research before I felt
Mm-hmm.
comfortable speaking out about this issue. Because of course, I knew as soon as I did, I was placing a target on my back, and so I had to kind of gain the level of knowledge for me to have the confidence to be able to speak out and express my views publicly. For obvious reasons, I think
Sure.
that's a huge challenge for anyone. And so I
It-
understand when I try to encourage other people to speak out, I
yeah.
understand the hesitancy to do that because of course you're going to be labeled, but now it's become easier, I think, because, I was an anti-vaxxer before it was cool. And I
Right.
use that label. I reject the label, of course. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm not anti-vaccine. But Merriam-Webster has actually helped make it easier on us because Merriam-Webster actually defines an anti-vaxxer as somebody who supports the right to informed consent. So yeah, I guess in that sense, by the dictionary
Okay.
definition,
Right.
I support the right to informed consent.
Yeah.
I mean, other parents might make different choices, but anyhow, yeah. To come back to that question, so yes, I was already very much deeply. I had deeply researched it. It was a number of years before I started writing about it. And so when I say around 2017, 2018, I think by 2018, that's pretty much all I was doing was writing about the vaccine issue and how public health policy systematically violates the right to informed consent. And that was my
Yeah.
issue. And also just my own experience dealing with doctors ignorance, their condescension, their arrogance, their
Yeah. And
lack of knowledge.
when you talk about public policy, are you specifically talking about like the idea that pharmaceutical companies can't be sued if something under the auspices of a vaccine,
Sure.
policies like that?
Yes, that's part of it. The legal immunity, the lack of a free market. I mean,
Right.
if we had a free market in healthcare, none of this would even exist.
That's right.
Because yes, the vaccine industry was essentially saved by government legislation in the mid '80s that granted broad legal immunity to the manufacturers against vaccine injury lawsuits.
Eh,
And so that's a huge part of it. Yes, absolutely. And just the more you understand about how the system works, and you have these federal agencies, the FDA, the CDC, and we're told that they serve public health. But I'm sorry, public health is not their job. They're
Yeah.
not into public health. They serve the pharmaceutical industry. Period.
Right.
And this is easy to demonstrate. Simply ask yourself the question. Look at COVID and look at the vaccines. And this is true of any vaccine, but look at what their policy was. It's a simple question. It's a simple question. Was the CD's policy to provide people with the information that they needed to make an informed choice about whether to get the COVID vaccines? Or was the CDC's policy to achieve a high vaccination rate? Which
Obviously
was
number
it?
two. Obviously
It
number
was
two.
number two. So
Yeah.
therefore, the CDC
Yeah.
were not interested in public health. They were interested in serving the pharmaceutical industry. It's
Right.
simple. It's
Right.
basic logic.
And,
They
and I,
don't serve public health.
And I think the fallacy that a lot of people could easily fall into is then what we need to do is we need to set up another organization to that maybe we get rid of the CDC, but we need to have something to help regulate and keep these pharmacy companies from putting out poisons into the world. And the fact is, like, that will get captured too. Like
Sure.
that it will get captured just like the CDC, and the only real answer over the long term is a free market system.
Yes.
A truly free market system
Yes.
that allows for profit and loss and companies to go bad and
Yes.
people to go to jail for fraud.
Yes, that's right. Because if you look at all the complaints that people have about how violative the industry is, it's how is it that the pharmaceutical industry has such power and influence? It's precisely because they don't operate in a free market. It's precisely because they leverage the use of government force.
Right.
It's the same with the central banks.
Yep.
The Federal Reserve. We need a free market. The Federal Reserve is a government legislated monopoly on the supply of currency.
That's right.
How central banks could not exist in a free market.
Right.
And what is the purpose? What is the function of a central bank? It's to effect an upward transfer of wealth from we, the masses, the poor and the middle class, to the top 1%.
That's exactly.
That is the purpose of central banking.
I had a conversation with somebody just the other day, about, we talk about the what are they called? The CDCs, the Bitcoin for central banks. I can't remember the exact term for it, but basically
central bank digital currency.
There you go.
Yeah,
CBDCs. Yeah. And how they're terrible. And while I agree they're terrible, and that just would it will just accelerate the theft. It's really, we have that right now. I mean, that is what the dollar is. A dollar is a manipulated instrument that decides who is rich and who is poor. And until we have the ability or take the ability to own our own money, it's not going to change. And I don't know if the answer is Bitcoin or gold but at some point we have to take control and own our own money, because otherwise it is a huge scandal or a huge ring of bosses that are it's exactly what Occupy Wall Street was fighting against, back in the early 2000s. Is we are the 99%. Well, yeah, and
Yeah.
they want to keep you the serfs.
The idea of central planning an economy is
Yes,
so logically ludicrous.
ludicrous.
And what people don't understand, like, there's this like reactionary, like people think of free market as like they react to that term.
Right.
Like the free market is some kind of evil idea. And they don't understand, like there is no, and then they talk about how wonderful democracy is. Well, there is no more perfect manifestation of democratic principles than the free market.
Yeah.
When people are engaging in voluntary exchange for mutual benefit, and this ties right into the pricing system and how prices are absolutely essential for allocating, for efficiently allocating scarce resources toward productive ends as determined by the will of consumers.
Yeah.
You can't get more perfect democracy than that system. The free
No.
market is the perfect democratic system. And people don't get that. And they think that we require, this handful of people in a room, trying to centrally
Oh,
plan our economy for us. It
yeah.
doesn't work.
It frustrates me, and I get it. Like guys who I respect, and I'll tell you why I respect them. Guys like Brett Weinstein, and the reason I respect Brett is because he, in my opinion, he's a truth teller. Now, I don't think he understands the full idea, but he sees that, like, he's willing to change his mind. Let me just say it that he was wrong, and then he was right on the COVID experience, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever he says, or people of his ilk say, and it's always these high academic people say, what we need is a system that blah. What we need is a system that blah. We need to think about an organization that does this. I cringe, because I think, wait a sec, no, you're already putting yourself at the top of an arbitrary pyramid hierarchy that doesn't exist, won't work, and will fail every single time, except for it doesn't fail, because what it does is it provides the power and the riches to those that it was intended to serve anyway. And so, what's the system? What's the organization that we need? We need individuals and families to make their own best self-interest decision, to work together. I mean, that's really what we need, and nothing more or less than that.
Yeah, local autonomy, local decision
Yeah.
making. Yeah, for sure. I mean, someday, Mike, when humankind becomes civilized, they'll look back at our present era and they're going to see us as barbarians.
Yeah.
And the whole institution of statehood, they're going to see as barbaric.
Yep.
So I look
No,
forward.
it is like, for the most of the atheists out there are part of the largest death cult in history, and that is the nation state. And they're firm believers in the nation state, and they're firm believers in this idea that if we elect the right person, or if we get our guy in power,
Right.
or if we topple this regime or that regime, that utopia will come, and that's not how it works.
Look at all the violence in history.
Yeah,
All the worst, horrific mass
all of it.
atrocities in history. Is it committed by private corporations? It's states.
Right.
The state exists. I don't like labels. I don't like to call myself a libertarian because that term has a lot of connotations to a
Sure.
lot of different people, and people have different interpretations of what that even means. But at its most basic, I consider myself a libertarian in as much as I believe in the principle of non-aggression.
Yeah.
The institution of the state exists. The purpose of the state is to use force to achieve ends.
Yeah.
So the whole concept of statehood violates the non-aggression principle. And this isn't to say that there's, government is bad. Government is
Right.
fine. Private businesses have a form of government. So, households have a form of government. We have rules in our house. We have,
That's right.
there's basic laws. You think about Christianity, for example, and there's God's laws. There's the Ten Commandments, and think about it. Cain and Abel. Well, Cain murdered Abel before the Ten Commandments. Does that mean it wasn't murder?
Right.
So there's customary international law. There's
That's right.
common law. There's concepts of like, no, we all just have this basic universal, these moral concepts that lead logically to conclusions of, well, this is right and this is wrong. And so there's these types of concepts, and basically everyone has a right to do whatever they want as long as they don't infringe on the equal rights of others. It's simple.
It is. It
And so that's
is.
just the basic principle of liberty. And if you commit aggression against someone, it could be coercion, fraud, theft, violence, any type of aggression on someone else. This is wrong.
Right.
And that is the purpose of the state, is the purpose of state governments, of national governments, is to use force to achieve ends. And they're not benevolent actors. I mean, and this is going back to the government education system, where we're taught to believe in the United States government as this benevolent force of good in the world, this beacon of light for humanity.
Right.
And we're taught all this stuff about how wonderful our government
Hey,
is, and this is
we
why
pray
this
to
goes
a
back
flag.
to
We pray to a flag every day.
right. Oh yeah, I pledge allegiance to the flag,
Right.
and I hated having to do that as a kid. It was just, even as a kid, I hated that. But it's that indoctrination, and this goes back to the point I was making earlier about how when I was trying to provide information about how the government was lying to start a war in Iraq, and just like the wall that I was confronted with of people, I couldn't get through to them.
Right.
And that was like really troubling to me. And it took quite a long time for me to kind of understand it and comprehend it. Like, why won't they listen? I just didn't get it. Because, for me, I just kind of assumed, well, people will be interested in truth and facts. And if they get the facts, they'll change their opinions. But it wasn't like that at all. And I couldn't figure it out. And I finally, what it was is that, like, I just realized, like, people just, they couldn't reconcile what I was saying with their belief.
Yeah.
Their belief system. Their belief that the U.S. government is a force of good. And yes, sometimes government makes mistakes, but only out of benevolent intent. And the idea that the government would lie to start a war just didn't fit in their belief system.
Right.
And
And
so
if
they
it's
just
proven,
reject
it's
it.
only if it's ever proven, it's not that the government was bad or that the system itself is faulty, but it was that party that was in charge that did it.
A
And
few
so now
bad
we have
apples.
right. So now we have a bad guy that we can now, and that's exactly what the power elite want us to do. Is they want us to be, all they want us to do is talk about this election for the next year. That is all they want to do. They don't want us to be looking at anything else. They just want us to be fighting amongst ourselves. And
Right. And then when I started just seeing how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were just like two heads of the same monster. And so there's this kind of false dichotomy and these false arguments, this false opposition that's always created. But then you look at foreign policy and it's like Democrats, Republicans, and the policies stay the same.
Yeah.
From Bush to Obama. The policies, if anything, Obama expanded on Bush's policies. It didn't end them. It didn't change. The war on terrorism continued. I mean, it was just like, I don't understand how people cannot see beyond that narrow spectrum of like left versus right kind of false dichotomy.
Well,
as though that's the entire range of like political opinion, is this narrow linear spectrum from left to right, liberal, conservative, Democrat,
right.
Republican, whatever terms you want to use, that narrow spectrum. I'm sorry, that's not that's not representative of political viewpoints. There's a huge broad range of viewpoints beyond that narrow spectrum.
Yeah, and you brought up the free market. The beautiful rainbow of colors that we have to choose from in every aspect of our life, except for the most important ones, that the people that are governing us We only have two, and again, those two, as you mentioned, are so narrow in scope. Like that it baffles the mind that we can't see this thing other than a and I'll say it, a devilish, cultish, um, satanic ideal of utopianism that would make any anarchist or libertarian just shudder, because it you can't but see the once your eyes are open to that, it's everywhere. Like it's the waters that we swim in.
Yeah, and you're never going to be able to see past the propaganda.
Right.
Like, if you can't get beyond the whole like left versus right thing, if you can't see past that, if you still view everything in terms of left versus right politics, like you're always going to be propagandized and deceived.
Yep.
You're always going to fall for the lies every time they want to try to justify a war or some crime. If they're going to try to justify tyranny at home with like the lockdowns, the coerced mass
Right.
vaccination based on lies. I mean, people are always going to be duped
And
if they can't even get past
and
that
the
little narrow
solutions are
paradigm.
always the same. That's the thing. The solutions are always the same. More money, more military force, and more governance on us.
Yep. CDC messed up. Oh, give them more money.
Right?
That'll fix it.
Yeah.
It's
It's
insane.
it's insane. And it's interesting. Like, even this conversation has been so interesting to me, Jeremy, because we started talking about like your history and kind of the practical aspects, that the actual historical things that brought you into the things that we do. And we've delved from there into this whole like kind of theory idea of the universe, of like what would a good, wholesome, and free society actually look like. And I hate to kind of bring it down, but because the consequences are so terrible and so great, and we're seeing it right now. The Let me say this. I want to preface what I'm about to say with this, and I'm so glad to be on a podcast where we can kind of you know pull some of these ideas out. um, One of the problems with government in itself as a concept, as an idea, I shouldn't say government, the problem with a nation state, with the state, is that it muddies the waters. And I don't think you see that any more obvious than in the Israel Palestinian conflict. Because what you have is anybody who's going to argue um, on behalf of the Israelis has to make the claim that there is an outside foreign body that made the decision that certain people were allowed to live in a certain place and other people were not allowed to live in a certain place. And so when you come to like, well, who owned the land and who was living there and who had a natural right to that land, and all of these kind of like really basic common again common sense, common law kind of ideals, you just muddy the waters in borders and governance and UNs and empires, and all these things just make what is supposed to be a very clear thing. Who does that belong to? Who is using that land? Who is living there? Turns into a whole thing of like nobody knows anything anymore. And so now we have to get an outside government authority to say these people live here and these people can't. And I'm wondering, like, uh, you know, as we talk about this, like, and the United States has kind of been the in Palestine, at least, has been the grandchild of the Ottomans and the British Empire. I mean, they've really taken over this whole conflict, and it's left an entire. I mean, now 5 million people just in utter ruin, in utter terror, and in absolute horrible conditions. And well, to say um, genocide is not too big of a term, and that takes me to the article that you wrote on December 12th that I was deeply moved by. Can you talk about that article? Talk about what's happening there, and just kind of talk about some of those things.
Sure. Just to quickly tie it into what you were saying about the nation state and
Yeah.
how there's kind of no. you put it better than I will, but you kind of like the Israel-Palestine conflict is such a perfect illustration of what's wrong with the entire concept. For example, we're told that Israel has a right to exist. This is a nonsensical concept. The
It is.
idea that that arbitrarily defined political entities have rights. No, I'm sorry. Individual human beings have rights. And it's not the case. And so the proper framework for discussion, so let's put things into proper framework for discussion. The proper framework for discussion is not the right of this or that state to exist, but the right of all peoples to self-determination. You won't find in international law anything about the right of a state to exist because it's a ludicrous concept. But you will find, for example, in the UN Charter, recognition of the right to peoples to self-determination. This is just an extension of the individual right to liberty and the right to freedom and the right to govern yourself and make your own choices as long as you don't infringe on the equal rights of others. Simple. And so when you exercise that right to liberty collectively, it's known under international law as the right to self-determination. And it's manifestly not the case that the Palestinians have been denying Israelis or the Jewish people their right to self-determination. It's manifestly the opposite case,
Right.
that Israel, the Zionists, have denied this right to the Palestinians. Hence the need to try to reframe the whole issue in terms of Israel's right to exist. And we're told that Palestinians reject Israel's right to exist. So therefore, the Palestinians become the bad guys,
Right.
by means of this propaganda narrative. And so what the demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel's right to exist, what that really is a demand for the Palestinians to recognize the means by which Israel was created.
That's right.
As having been legitimate. So the question is, how was Israel created? Israel was created by ethnically cleansing most of the Arab population from their homes in Palestine. That's how Israel came into existence.
And it's not what, and although we can make a case for like a long term, I mean, this was a very specific and deliberate thing that happened at a very specific, deliberate time. Am I correct about that?
Well, yes. Although it really, this all happened, the Mandate era, just to quickly summarize, and I'll get to the article on what's happening in Gaza. So during World War I, Britain, invaded Palestine, took it over, gained control of it from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved by the end of the war. We had the League of Nations was established, created this mandate system to kind of, according to the charter of the League of Nations, the purpose of the mandates was to tutor the people of the region, the former Ottoman territories, in their exercise of self-determination, to help them gain their independence. This was the purpose. So when it came to the mandate, the Palestine mandate, the British occupation in Palestine, the League of Nations violated its own charter. The mandate was the Palestine mandate was actually drafted by the Zionists, the same as the Balfour Declaration was actually drafted by Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, not by Arthur Balfour, the British foreign minister. It was drafted by the Zionists.
This is not conspiracy. This is like a proven 100%
You can
fact.
go to the British government's own website. They have a website dedicated to the Balfour Declaration, and they show you the drafts, and they talk about it, and they explain the whole history. So no, this was the case. You can read in the Peel Commission report how the mandate for Palestine was drafted by the Zionist organization in the interests of the Zionist movement.
Yeah.
And so what you had was a belligerent occupation by the British to deny the Palestinians their right to self-determination for the purpose of facilitating the Zionist project to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state. By 1937, with the Peel Commission report, you had the Peel Commission proposing the first partition of Palestine into a separate Jewish and Arab state. But their partition plan would have required what they called the compulsory transfer. That was the term, the compulsory transfer of hundreds of thousands of Arab Palestinians out of the proposed territory of the Jewish state. when the British government put their rubber stamp on the concept of ethnic cleansing, the Zionist leadership openly, they stopped talking about it in secret and whispering about it. They were openly in favor of ethnically cleansing Palestine from 1937 forward.
Mm-hmm.
They were openly talking about
And by the
ethnically
way,
cleansing Palestine.
when you say forward, like, and this is just burned into my soul. The on Christmas Day, the tweet that the Jerusalem Post put out with a picture of the Sinai Peninsula, saying this would be a good place for the Palestinians to move to. Like, there's no more clear definition of ethnic cleansing than that right there.
Yeah, so let's when 1947 you had the UN
Yes.
partition plan resolution, which went nowhere. So just to quickly wrap this up, UN Resolution 181 neither partitioned Palestine nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionist leadership for the unilateral declaration of the existence of the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948. By that time, 250,000 Arabs had already been ethnically cleansed from their homes. The neighboring Arab states intervened to try to stop the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. Didn't succeed very well. Jordan managed to hold on to the West Bank. Egypt managed to hold on to the area which we call the Gaza Strip. So let's come to today. 70%.
By the way, and I'm sorry because I need to
Go ahead.
ask you about this, and this is and I'm going to pronounce it the Nakba. Is that
Nakba,
the Nakba, which is a specific time when 750,000 Arabs were moved off the land. I don't know the time frame when it happened, but I know it happened. It's very clear that it happened, and I'm kind of shocked that there are a lot of people that deny that this event occurred.
The denials are untenable. And I've written an article, and it turned it into a short ebook called Benny Morris's Untenable Denial of the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. So Benny Morris, for people who don't know, is a preeminent Israeli historian. He's written numerous books on the origin of the refugee problem, what they call the Palestinian refugee problem, including the book 1948. And he has, on one hand, he has said things like, without the expulsion of 700,000, actually the estimate that seems most realistic to me is 750,000. But in the quote, he said 700,000. So yeah, without the expulsion of 700,000 Arabs, the Jewish state couldn't have come into being. Therefore, it was necessary to expel them. Okay, so he's a Zionist. He maintains the Zionist ideology. And so he's also an Israeli historian. So he's an Israeli historian who writes through the perspective of being ideologically Zionist. And so later on, years after that quote, he has tried to deny in the pages of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that ethnic cleansing occurred. And I wrote this article and ebook documenting how his denial is untenable. And you can show how his claim that it wasn't ethnic cleansing is contradicted by his own documentation from his own research. And so yeah, the denials are untenable. So time frame, you asked about time frame. So from the end of November 1947, which was when the partition plan resolution was adopted by the General Assembly, to mid-May 1948. From that time, about 250,000 or more Arabs had already been ethnically cleansed. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, 750,000 Arabs had become refugees. Over 500 Arab villages were literally wiped off the map, so that the demographically Jewish state could come into existence. Okay, so that's kind of the time frame.
Yeah.
And then, so 70% of the population of Gaza today is refugees or their descendants from al-Nakba, which is Arabic for the catastrophe, which is how they refer to the establishment of the establishment of the state of Israel through the ethnic cleansing. So the Nakba is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
And to me, and again, because I'm hearing arguments, and you've heard them more times than I have, I'm sure. But the arguments of such like, well, that was a long time ago. They need to get over it. The Indians got over it. I mean, there's a bunch of really kind of weak arguments. But I just want to say the reason why the time frame is important is because this was, I mean, in historical terms, yesterday. There are
Right.
people still alive today that experienced that very thing, and
We still hold
um,
the keys to the homes that they were expelled from.
that's right. That's right. And and so for somebody to be kind of um so calloused to say, get over it or go find a new place or whatever they want to say, like, that doesn't change the fact that these people were absolutely pulled off their land, and it was a wrong that happened to them. And however they decide, like, if um I live in Arizona. If the Mexican government decided that they wanted to ethnically cleanse all of the white people out of Arizona, I would not be too happy about being pushed out of my house. And I'll bet you my kids would be even less happy, and I'll bet the grandkids would probably be even angrier, because that's just how this stuff works. And to deny that kind of human nature is insanity on its face.
Right. And this is the reason the conflict persists, because there was this historical injustice where you had this manifestation of the rejection of Palestinian self-determination in the form of ethnic cleansing. And until that injustice is righted and this wrong is corrected.
And I want to say, like, just from my tentative research, it's kind of worse than that, because not only was that justice happened to him and it's never been righted, but it's always been teased at, or it's always been there's all these, seemingly to me, seems like, fake outs, where it seems like there's going to be a peace process, where it seems like they may not get their land back, but they're gonna have their own state. But it always ends up looking more apartheid and prison camp than it does an actual running state. And nobody can blame the Palestinians for how Gaza looks, because they have no control over how Gaza looks or how it's being run. As much as as much as the Israelis, as the Zionists want to say they do, they just don't. They just don't.
Yeah, there's this propaganda claim that, well, look, at Israel withdrew in 2005, and so this is the consequence of what happens when you let the Palestinians have their freedom. But the idea that Israel's occupation of Gaza ended in 2005 is utterly ludicrous. Again, it's just an anti-intellectual claim. The you know you Israel's blockade began in 1967. Actually, people talk about the blockade beginning in 2006, 2007. That's not true. Actually, Israel has controlled the territory of Gaza since the 1967 war. In 2004, Israel's National Security Council head Jora Eiland described Gaza as a, quote, huge concentration camp, appropriately. 2005, 2006, you had Hamas participating in municipal and then parliamentary elections, defeating Fatah, the party of PA President Mahmoud Abbas. That's how Hamas came to be the legitimate governing authority in all of the Palestinian occupied territories. You had the U.S. and Israel then support Fatah in a violent coup attempt against the Hamas-led government that failed. Hamas expelled Fatah from Gaza, and this is what is described in the Western mainstream media as the Hamas violent coup in Gaza. And this is how we're told that Hamas came to power in Gaza. In response to that failed coup attempt against the democratically elected government, Israel escalated its blockade policy into a state of siege against the Gaza Strip, where you had Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's top advisor, Dov Weissglass, joking, that the purpose was, he said, it'll be like an appointment with a dietitian. The Palestinians will get a lot thinner, but they won't die. At one point, Israel was literally counting the number of calories that the population needed to be able to determine how much food they were going to allow into Gaza. They were literally calculating the number of calories to maintain them at what Norman Finkelstein appropriately describes as starvation plus diet. Items that Israel was blockading at one point included like chocolate, potato chips, notebooks for schools. I mean, just ridiculous, absurd stuff. That so the idea that Gaza became free in 2005 is just utterly ahistorical. It's asinine, stupid propaganda. But and yet you hear it claimed, and like people who like we're supposed to take seriously make these types of claims. It's utterly absurd. Of course, there's no dispute about it under international law. You won't find any authoritative um, UN agency or human rights organization who will agree with this claim that Israel's occupation ended in 2005. Israel has remained the occupying power in Gaza by virtue of its control of the territory. It withdrew its ground troops. It withdrew settlers in 2005. It maintained control over Gaza's land crossings, over its territorial waters, over its airspace, over its administrative functions. Nothing gets into or out of Gaza without Israel's permission. So, so this is the state of Gaza. Gaza is a huge concentration camp.
And so it should, with like, and I think this has been a really important premise to come up to October 7th, because you've got to understand, like, it should surprise absolutely zero people that Hamas broke out of that concentration camp and went after Israelis. And you can say, I mean, I would say, like, going after the innocent people, like 100% wrong. Like, they should not do that. Should they target Israeli leaders and their occupiers? Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer, but I do know that you have to understand what happened in order to not be surprised by what they did.
Yeah. So on that point, it's also a recognized right under international law that an occupied people have a right to the use of arms against their occupier. Okay, so the Palestinian people have a right to use armed force against the occupying power. That said, of course, all parties to any conflict must exercise their right to self-defense, their right to resistance to an occupying foreign military occupying power. They must exercise those rights within the realm of morality, which is, basically you attack military targets, you don't attack civilian targets. And so Hamas did attack military targets on October 7th. Of course, they also committed horrific atrocities in attacking Israeli civilians as well, and taking Israeli civilians hostages, which is, of course, also a war crime. But you look at the language used. So when we describe the Israelis who were taken out of Israel into Gaza, they're rightly described as hostages. And you have a different terminology entirely when Israel goes into the occupied territories, takes women, children, removes them from the occupied territories, which, by the way, is also against international law. We don't call them hostages. In the Western media, they're not described as hostages. They're detainees.
Prisoners.
Or prisoners. Yeah. Well, okay, what's the distinction?
Right.
They're hostages. And by the way, there's women and children being held in what's called administrative detention in Israel, which is the prisoners
right.
are held without charge, without trial. They're held indefinitely without charge or trial. They're just in this state of legal limbo, which of course just violates all principles of justice. And again, removing Palestinians from the occupied territories to Israeli prisons is itself a war crime. It's a violation of international law. Israel is not allowed to do that legally. And so you look at the language that's used. You have hostages on one side versus detainees and prisoners on the other. It's all very prejudicial against the Palestinians. And we could look at other examples of the use of language, but going into the peace process in particular. But let's stick with the events of 10/7 and what's been happening since. So yeah, there were horrific atrocities. And another caveat to this is that there's quite a bit of evidence that a lot of the Israeli civilians that were killed by Israeli forces in the crossfire.
Yeah.
So the Israeli forces were firing indiscriminately on their own people, killing hostages along with Hamas terrorists. So that's another aspect of this.
By the way, and let me ask this, because I don't want to add a parallelism where there is none, right? Like, I don't want to, but in the same way, it still baffles me. In the same way that 9/11 was foreseen and was, excuse me, it was foreseen. We knew it was going to happen. We knew when it was going to happen, and I don't understand how the most secured, the Gaza Strip, had the most, uh, the great biggest prison camp in the world, with eyes everywhere from the IDF. How could they? Two questions. Number one, how did they not foresee that this happening? Was it just hubris, which is kind of what we're hearing? And number two, how did they not see the training that had to happen, the kind of weapons, the kind of material that had to come in if they're controlling everything? So that's kind of my question on how those things happened.
Yeah, well, we touched on that in our last discussion, and at the time, I think I had mentioned that I hadn't really seen any evidence of foreknowledge, like actionable foreknowledge. There were reports, Egyptian intelligence had warned of some possible event, but this is just kind of standard routine stuff. But since then, since we last talked, the New York Times had a very detailed investigative report showing clearly, absolutely, that the Israeli intelligence knew about it. They knew about it. They absolutely knew about it, and they warned the government. And so the foreknowledge is now a known fact that the Israeli government had advanced knowledge that Hamas was planning a major operation. And so then the question is, well, then was it allowed to happen? A lot of people I know are convinced that, which I understand, because, there's this kind of view of Israeli intelligence, of Mossad, as kind of these, like almost like mythical type of powerful intelligence forces. The Israeli military is ranked as one of the most powerful militaries in the world. We kind of have this kind of almost mythical view of the might of the Israeli military and its competence. And I really think what we saw was really, I think, attributable to hubris, to be honest, because number one, the Netanyahu government, I really think that it was Netanyahu's policies that led to this. It really was a failure of policy related to it. And look at it. It hasn't served his political interests at all. Apart from, obviously his government has used it as, similar to how the neocons used 9/11 as an opportunity. Right. So Netanyahu has used it as an opportunity to try to finish the job in Gaza of what was started in 1948, 1947. But I don't think this was a plan. I don't think I don't think that Netanyahu's government allowed it to happen as a pretext to perpetrate this genocide in Gaza. I really think it's a reactionary response that has been really done without any kind of pre-planning at all. With no exit strategy. I mean, the only exit strategy is basically, this comes to the article that you wanted to discuss. Looking at the article that I had written that you wanted to discuss.
Yeah.
I guess this brings us to that.
Yeah.
So, you look at what they've been saying. I guess I can come back to that, because just to wrap up the point you're asking about, this the foreknowledge. How could they not? I really think you look at certain aspects of Netanyahu's policy. Number one, using Hamas as a strategic ally,
for sure,
specifically for the purpose of ensuring that there was no movement towards peace negotiations with the Palestinians. This is open, explicit. This was the purpose of Netanyahu's policy. Netanyahu was using Hamas as a strategic ally.
We can control the height of the
Israeli newspapers on that. You don't need to take my word for that. You can read the Israeli media. It's all over the place. This is just it was an open policy that he was doing that. um, advancing Sharon's disengagement plan. So the 2005 withdrawal of forces from Gaza while maintaining the occupation, the status as an occupying power in Gaza, was part of what was called the disengagement plan. It was basically they were giving up on the goal of settling Gaza in addition to settling the West Bank, to be able to shift the resources, to gain the political leverage necessary towards expanding the illegal settlement regime in the West Bank. This also was open and blatant and brazen. Again, Sharon's top advisor, Dov Weissglass, described this disengagement plan as the, quote, formaldehyde necessary to put the peace process, in its coffin.
Right.
And so again, this is explicit policy of blocking any movement towards peace negotiations with the Palestinians. Netanyahu took that policy and advanced it and expanded it. And so this was his explicit goal. Shifting resources, moving soldiers off of the armistice line in Gaza into the West Bank to protect settlers who have been violently attacking. You have the Israeli settler attacks against Palestinians. By the way, what's happening is it's not just in Gaza. Also, the West Bank is becoming increasingly chaotic, increasing number of deaths, settler attacks, Israeli raids.
Which you
it's
could
happening
predict
in the West Bank on a much lesser scale and extent, but the violence has greatly escalated in the West Bank as well. So he had these explicit policies. There was the whole judicial coup, as it's been described in Israeli media, where Netanyahu is trying to reform the judiciary to bring it under his government's control so it had less independence. It would stand less in the way of his policy agendas. And that led to Israeli reservists refusing duty, Air Force people refusing duty. It was really dividing Israeli society to the extent where it was causing this political uprising, this protest movement within the Israeli military. You had the heads of the Israeli military warning, like, this is really putting us in a position like we will not be able to defend this country if something happens. Like, they were saying that.
Wow.
And so to me, it's really believable that the attacks were not allowed to happen. I really think Netanyahu's government turned a blind eye to the intelligence. And it really was hubris, where he thought that Netanyahu convinced himself that the Gazans were contained in their concentration camp, and he had Hamas in there serving his purpose.
Right.
He thought Hamas was contained in there, and he wasn't willing to see it any other way. And he really turned up. This is blowback for him. It's
the
clear
definition
to me
of
that at least him, you could make an argument that people within his government or something somehow were involved in allowing it to happen somehow. But in terms of Netanyahu himself, absolutely, there's just no way. You look at his polls. The only reason he's still in office right now is because of the solidarity of we need to respond to the Hamas attacks. And so we have this war coalition. And that's the only reason he's still in power. And we can anticipate he's not going to be, once Israel's military operation ends, we can anticipate Netanyahu's career. He's done. So I don't believe I get a lot of pushback. I get a lot of pushback for saying this, but I don't. Even with the now we have knowledge, we know that there was foreknowledge. Like, the New York Times report is clear about that. But that hasn't changed my overall assessment, because you look at Netanyahu's policies, and it's really believable that it really was a failure of the military and intelligence.
Well, I appreciate
the political leadership.
Yeah, I appreciate your conservative and approach to that. I think it's wise to see where the evidence takes us and not jump to conclusions where we don't have to. Because it's easy to make.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. If we can otherwise explain it, I think we should maintain conservative conclusions and not make leaps of logic. So if it wasn't otherwise explainable, I would probably also arrive at the conclusion that they must have allowed it to happen, because for all the reasons we've described. But in this case, looking at the political context and Netanyahu's policies, that alone explains it to
And
me.
you were going to go here, but I think one of those evidences that you're citing is that they weren't, while they had foreknowledge, they were probably not prepared and didn't have a strategic plan. Is what's happening, that they have painted themselves in a corner. Can you talk about that and talk about, because I think that takes us right into that December 12th article.
Yeah, so I think the operation in Gaza was not pre-planned. And it's not like Operation Cast Lead in 2000, which December 27th, 2008 to January 18th, 2009, which I documented extensively in my book, Obstacle to Peace. That operation was pre-planned. There was a ceasefire even before the ceasefire. There was a 6-month ceasefire with Hamas, which, by the way, was broken by Israel uncontroversially. Hamas honored that ceasefire. It was violated by Israel, specifically to provoke reactions and responses, is to create a pretext for its pre-planned operation. Okay, that operation was pre-planned. This one, I haven't seen any evidence that it was. It really was like a knee-jerk reaction. Like, we were attacked on 10/7. We are going to respond. And if you look at the declarations from Israeli leaders, influential people in Israeli society, journalists, Knesset members, top heads of the military, top political officials, Netanyahu invoking the Amalekites in the Bible,
Right.
which was the Israelite genocide of the tribe, the Amalek tribe. They have been openly genocidal in their declared intentions, openly genocidal. So that's number one.
By the way, is that, and maybe I should save this for the end, but I mean, that seems, it's kind of like when you get a man drunk, he speaks the truth. Is this kind of what, is there evidence to say that this is how, although it was pre-planned, their intention at some point was always to clear Gaza and clear the West Bank?
Sure, it's the logical corollary of the Zionist ideology. It's the logical corollary of the ideology that created Israel through the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in the first place.
Right, right.
And so this is what I mean when I say, it's the Netanyahu government sees the Hamas attacks of 10/7 as an opportunity to essentially finish what it started in 1948. This is what I meant by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really, the thin veil has been lifted, and the true face of modern political Zionism is there for all to see. This is what it's always been. It's just, a question of what could Israel get away with politically, what was politically feasible. And Israel has been getting away with genocide in Gaza because it has had the U.S.'s support for this genocide. And it has been perpetrating what meets the definition of genocide within the limits of political feasibility. Because you hear people make this argument like, well, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, it would just flatten the place in 3 days.
Right.
Right. Well, okay, there are limits to what's politically feasible. And so when I say Israel is committing genocide to the limits of what is politically feasible, right up to the very limits of what's politically feasible.
And I think a bold and brave, but I think a true move that you make in your article is you make the distinction between yourself and the New York Times, where the New York Times would call that, part of war. You say, no, this is not war. This is genocide.
Right. I mean, the ticker tapes and, the news, they always show, or, and when you're reading the newspapers, they have this category, the Israel-Hamas war. The Israel-Hamas war. Well, when you have a situation where you have one of the most advanced, powerful militaries, literally, I mean, there are rankings. They have like annual rankings for military might, and Israel is ranked I think in the last one I read, it was ranked like 10th in the world in terms of its military power. It is a major military power. It's one of the most powerful. It's regularly described as one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. It's armed with, heavy weaponry. It's got Apache Cobra attack helicopters, U.S.
F-16s.
supplied,
He's got
F-16s. It's got fighter jets and
and
bombers
and
supplied.
and some would say it's got a nuclear weapon or two.
Yes, well, this is also quite uncontroversial.
Right.
Controversial in the sense that Israel has never admitted it
Admitted. Right.
officially. But certainly, it's uncontroversial that the world knows that Israel has a nuclear capability. So when you have one of the world's most powerful militaries raining down 2,000-pound bombs on a defenseless civilian population, and when I say defenseless, okay, Hamas has a non-zero capability of putting up resistance to Israeli ground forces. Okay. But the Palestinian people, they have no military. They have no army. They have no air force. They have no navy. They are a defenseless population.
Yeah, it'd be the same as the Pentagon, putting all 5 branches of the military against an Indian tribe, an Indian reservation or something. It's
And calling it a
really
war.
the equivalent, and calling it a war, right?
Yeah, so this is what I mean. This is when you have one of the world's most powerful militaries raining down death and destruction on a literally defenseless civilian population. That's not war. I think to describe that as war is just intellectual dishonesty. It's not a war. It's a massacre.
And by the way, it's also, I think it does the word war disservice, because how would this be any kind of justified war anyway? In other words, like, if your purpose is to go in and root out Hamas and root out the people that that planned, organized, and committed this attack on October 7th, that's not a war. That's a police action. You can call it a bunch of stuff, but what it's not is a war. And so what's happening there is neither a police action nor a war. It's something else.
It's something else. Right. And it's massive war crimes. And, in the beginning, people were putting up this defense of, well, Israel is targeting Hamas. Israel does its utmost to avoid harm to civilians. And that was the same thing during Operation Cast Lead. It was untenable during Operation Cast Lead. It was untenable during Operation Pillar of Cloud. It was untenable during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. All of these prior operations, it's always been untenable. The claims about Hamas using Al-Shifa as a military headquarters and with this massive underground base below the hospital.
Right.
Well, we heard about that back in 2008, 2009 during Operation Cast Lead. No evidence ever produced. Same thing here. The claim that civilians only die because they're being used by Hamas as human shields depends on a euphemistic use of the term human shields that is incompatible with its definition under international law. Because what Israel means when it describes Palestinians as being used as human shields, it means all Palestinians in Gaza by virtue of their being in Gaza. That's what a human shield is.
Right.
So any civilian that's killed in Gaza is described as a human shield.
And by the way,
because they were killed in Gaza.
Right. And the proof of that is not just on its face, true because of, what's happening. But sometimes I think, especially in America, when we have this very, we have a view of what the Middle East is like. We have a view of who Israel is. And we have a view of who the people in Gaza are, the Palestinians are. We think of the Palestinians as this kind of like, Arab, Muslim, folk who are kind of backwards and living in a third world country. And unfortunately, like what we're seeing now is we're seeing IDF sniping at Christian churches, murdering in cold blood, as far as I can tell, women who have nothing, who probably didn't vote for Hamas back in 2005 and probably wouldn't today, but because they are Palestinians, because they're going to church, a Christian church. They're somehow being used as human shields. It makes zero sense, and it's absolutely. I really want my audience to know, like, it's not a bunch of radical Muslims. This isn't a holy war that's going on. What's going on is an absolute genocide, as you say. I'm going to use that term as well. It's a genocide that's happening, and anybody gets in the way is a victim.
Sure. Yeah, you had the event. Well, back in October, I think October 19th or 20th, is one incident where a church was targeted. That was in central Gaza. More recently, mid-December, there was the attack on the Catholic parish, I think in northern Gaza, which the Pope himself condemned as an act of terrorism. A mother and her daughter in the church compound were sniped and murdered by Israeli sniper. Yeah, you have these attacks where, the Vatican put out a statement describing, saying that there was no possible military objective. They weren't being used as human shields. This was just cold. The cardinal in England described it as cold-blooded murder, which it was, of
Which it
course.
was, yeah.
And so
And
the
that's
whole
happening.
pretense.
And that's happening like on a gigantic scale. Like you can name these individuals, and what did Stalin say? One person killed is murder. 10,000 or 1,000,000 is a statistic, and that's what's happening. Is they're trying to turn this into a statistic.
Yeah, and in terms of statistics, over 22,000 now. This is minimal. Are estimated dead, and I say that's a conservative estimate because, of course, there are many, many more who are missing, and buried under the rubble. People don't know the true extent, or the true death toll, so they can only put out this kind of conservative, minimal estimates of the numbers of dead. 70% are women and children. Well, what would you expect? What would you expect the proportions to be if Israel was actually targeting Hamas? Would you expect the proportion of women and children dead to be approximately the proportion of women and children in the population? Well, this is the proportion you would expect if Israel was indiscriminately bombarding the civilian population. You would expect about 70% to be women and children, and that's
right,
exactly what we see. Why?
That's the
Because
populace.
Israel is indiscriminately bombing the civilian population.
Right.
It's simple.
Right. And
so this idea
yeah.
that Israel is targeting Hamas is ludicrous. Anyone with eyes to see can open their eyes and see that Israel is not targeting Hamas. Israel is targeting the civilian population. Yeah. It has declared its intention openly, repeatedly, since the very beginning, to target the civilian population.
That's right.
This is, I don't know why this doesn't get through people's skulls. I don't get it. Like, when you have Israeli leaders openly declaring their intent, and of course, they have this caveat. The IDF puts out these statements that we're doing, in response to appease the U.S. regime that is supporting this. Right. The U.S. requires the IDF to put out these statements of like, well, we're taking steps to limit the harms to the civilian population. Another example, several weeks ago, finally, there was only the Rafah crossing was open for humanitarian relief, which is a cynical farce, because even before 10/7, there were 500 truckloads of humanitarian supplies needed per day through the crossings, just to maintain the Palestinian populations at subsistence level. 500 trucks per day. Right now, at a time when that needs to be ramped up,
right,
like many times,
yeah,
there's like maybe about 100 trucks a day. It's a cynical propaganda, public relations ploy. It doesn't even begin to meet the needs at a time when the humanitarian, it's just absolute humanitarian catastrophe.
Oh, you're seeing entire blocks of neighborhoods just crumble.
Entire multi-generational families, families wiped out.
I would encourage everybody, go to jeremyrhammond.com, go look up the article on December 12th, and all you need to do, I would recommend read the article, look at the pictures though. Just look at the pictures that he
Look at the
provides.
pictures.
There's no way there's any kind of targeting going on.
So let's describe those graphics. And so that article, what prompted me to write that article was an interactive feature in the New York Times where they showed satellite imagery from northern Gaza of what the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have been doing in North Gaza. And so they had before, and there were these huge graphic features where there was a slider, and you could just slide it left and right and see and to compare before and after of what Gaza looked like from satellite surveillance. And the IDF has literally turned North Gaza into a wasteland. And you have a before, and you see neighborhoods, buildings, orchards, farmland, greenhouses, and you swipe it, and it's all gone. Just leveled. Everything. Like they've turned it into a desert wasteland. They have flattened it completely.
Completely gone.
And it's just image after image of just wasteland. So evidently, Hamas uses orchards as floral shields.
Well, the tunnel.
How do you explain this?
Right? There's tunnels everywhere.
It's insane for people to say that, oh, well, Israel is targeting Hamas and it needs this operation to get Hamas and it does everything possible. No, Israel is fulfilling. We can see that it is implementing a policy of making Gaza uninhabitable. That's the declared intent, and that's what we see happening on the ground. Israel's plan is to make Gaza uninhabitable.
Yeah.
And so the Palestinians are left with a choice. And this is also just open and it is near as explicit as you can be, that the choice left to the Palestinians is they can flee through Rafah and live in tent cities in the Sinai Desert, which Egypt won't let them do because Egypt doesn't want to take responsibility for a humanitarian catastrophe
for Israel's
perpetrated
crimes
by Israel. So
right.
So Egypt is not going to open the Rafah crossing to allow hundreds of thousands, millions. The population is 2.2 million. It's not going to open the Rafah crossing to allow Palestinian refugees, refugees repeatedly. Again, remember, 70% of the population is refugees from the 1948 ethnic cleansing or the descendants. At the start of its operations, Israel ordered the 1.1 million Gazans living north of what's called the Wadi Gaza. There's a wetland area that kind of bisects Gaza into northern and southern halves. So everyone living north of that line, 1.1 million people were told to flee south, which many of them did, while Israel was bombing the south as well. And repeatedly, you have a situation where you have refugees, internally displaced persons, as they're called, fleeing to places like hospitals, UN-run schools, churches, fleeing to wherever they think, that there might be some semblance of shelter and safety. Yeah. And Israel is systematically targeting those places, systematically targeting the hospitals. Out of 36 hospitals in Gaza, I think as of yesterday, only 13 were even partially functional.
Oh, wow. Oh, man.
So you have and like Israel going into places to shut them down, like going into Al Shifa and shutting it down.
Their bases.
And expelling the people who were expelling not only the refugees who were there trying to find some kind of shelter, but also the sick and injured, like pulling the plugs on incubators and premature babies dying because the hospital was shut down. And this is systematic. Al Shifa is one where it was very prominent and prominently featured because of Israel's propaganda claim, for which it has produced no evidence. And even, like Washington Post had a feature on this several weeks back, where they we're looking at all the claims that the IDF made, and the supposed evidence that the IDF has produced to try to support its claim. Because it had justified its operation against Al Shifa Hospital um, on the basis of the claim, and it produced this like graphic, like computer generated animation of what it showed as like this multi-level, like massive military headquarters bunkered underneath, this bunker system underneath the hospital. That's what it claimed was there. Not a shred of evidence that such
And
headquarters. And you mentioned there is a basement, there is a bunker basement
right.
in the hospital, but that was built by the Israelis. I mean, like you said, they knew it was there because they built it. And so you have just this horrific false propaganda narrative for which Israel, they're lying. Of course, this is what the IDF does. They lie and they lie. We don't use white phosphorus munitions. Like these types of claims. You have systematic targeting of the civilian infrastructure. Farmland, greenhouses, hospitals, schools, UN-run schools being used to shelter civilians. And so you have people like fleeing from place to place to place. Like they fled the north and they went south, and then they were told to leave the south and flee where?
Right.
People like going from school refugee camp to refugee camp, trying to find some kind of. There's no place safe. There's no place for them to go. And yeah, so it's a systematic targeting of the civilian population and civilian infrastructure of Gaza. That's what it is. The idea that they're targeting Hamas is ludicrous. It's ludicrous.
Right.
Yeah. And by the way, Hamas is still there. I mean, they claim that their goal of their operation is to eliminate Hamas.
And this is to me like eliminating Hamas is to me the equivalent of like I don't know, eliminating Marxism or eliminating Nazi. Like it's an idea. You don't eliminate it, and as long as there's power, and that power comes from anger, and that anger comes from a wrong and wrong after wrong after wrong that has been done to them, it just fuels like. So they get rid of every single Hamas member. Well, Hamas 2 is right around the corner. I mean, this is
right.
That's the silliness of it. Is like nothing changes unless two things happen. There's some sort of conciliatory, some sort of recognition by the Zionists, by Israel, that things were wrong, and while they can't make things right, they can do something, or they're dead. I really don't see, like, the more I look at this and I look at the options, I suppose Egypt may someday open up its borders or something like that might happen, in a desperate situation. But either way, from the river to the sea, Israel is free. I don't know I don't see another option. And I'm just a dumb musician. I'm a crazy musician. I'm not the smartest cookie in the bin, but I don't see another option from that. From what's happening.
I've come around to sharing that view. I used to, when I wrote Obstacle to Peace, which was published in 2016, my view was kind of favoring the idea of a single state solution. But then the question being, how do we get there? And so what I advocated in the book was, let's first implement the two-state solution, which effectively just means end the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah.
That's what it means. I mean, implementing Resolution 242, that's what the two-state solution is based on. So the two, and here's a distinction that people need to be aware of, is that the two-state solution, the one that the international community favors, and based on UN Resolution 242, is based on the applicability of international law to the conflict. So UN 242 being the UN Security Council resolution passed in the wake of the 1967 war that was started by Israel with a surprise attack on Egypt, not vice versa. So that resolution calling on Israel to withdraw its forces to the pre-June 5th lines, so sometimes called the 1967 lines, sometimes called the Green Line, sometimes called the 1949 armistice lines. These all mean the same things. They're armistice lines. So the requirement being that Israel needed to fully and immediately withdraw its forces in compliance with international law, which, of course, Israel has had its own unilateral interpretation of, which is that Israel, it doesn't need to withdraw until there's a final peace settlement. And so the people living under occupation must negotiate with the occupying power over how much of their own land they're going to be allowed to continue living in, and then maybe exercising some kind of limited autonomy over. That's Israel's interpretation of UN Resolution 242, which has no basis, it has no legitimacy.
No.
But this is the interpretation of 242 that the U.S. has agreed to and adopted as the premise, as the foundation of what's called the peace process, quote unquote, peace process. That's the peace process. So the peace process, in reality, was always the means by which Israel and its superpower benefactor blocked implementation of the two-state solution in favor of a two-state solution grounded on the premise of the inapplicability of international law to the conflict. So people need to understand that. The peace process was never about implementing the two-state solution. It was always the means to block implementation of the two-state solution. That's incredibly important for people to understand. For all the details, they can read Obstacle to Peace.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's just a really critical point to emphasize. And then you hear, I mentioned earlier the use of language. You hear the term concessions, for example. You hear Israel has made concessions, and the Palestinians have always rejected their own state. They rejected their own state in 1937 with the Peel Commission partition plan, which called for the compulsory transfer of hundreds of thousands of Arabs out of the Jewish state so that that state could be a demographically Jewish state. Well, so they were unreasonable for rejecting ethnic cleansing?
Right.
Really? They were being intransigent and unreasonable by rejecting that? This is what the level of intellectualism, when you hear that, well, they've repeatedly rejected offers for a state of their own. It's idiocy.
It is idiocy.
In 1947 UN partition plan, Jews owned about 7% of the land in Palestine. Arabs owned more land in every single district of Palestine. By that time, mainly through immigration, the Jewish population had increased, but it was still only about 30% of the population. The majority population was still Arab Muslims and Christians, mostly Muslims, but also a sizable Christian population.
Right.
And yet the partition plan called for the Jewish state to be established on 55% of the land of historic Palestine. This was ludicrous. It was ludicrously unjust and inequitable. And the inequitability of it is acknowledged in the report itself. If you read, so the partition plan recommendation was the product of a commission called the UN Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP. And you can read the UNSCOP report for yourself, and you can see right in there how they readily admit that the principle of self-determination, which is, of course, explicitly recognized in the UN Charter as a universal right of all peoples, that the principle of self-determination was not applied to Palestine, obviously to advance the agenda of the Zionists to create their Jewish state there.
Right.
So it's right in there. It's like they're literally saying, well, yeah, we have to reject the right of Palestinians to self-determination because we want to help the Jews establish this state.
And again, the propaganda is so deep. I've read and listened to many interviews where Zionists and Israel defenders will say, they literally just say Israel or the Arabs rejected, the plan, so Israel had to go to war. Like, those two things are illogical. That doesn't make sense.
And it's insane that this type of propaganda is even. It's so widespread, and so many people just buy right into it. But it's just so simple to see through this thin veil of lies and deception. I mean, you want to see who the real rejectionists are? You want to know who the rejectionists are? Look at the UN resolutions that are passed every year annually in the General Assembly. There's two of them in particular. One is a reaffirmation of the two-state solution. Well, guess who votes against that every single year in the UN's General Assembly?
United States.
Israel and the United States.
Yeah.
There's another one. It's a reaffirmation. It's a very short resolution. It simply reaffirms that the right to self-determination is an internationally recognized right, codified in the UN Charter. The Palestinians have a right to self-determination, and the international community has an obligation to help the Palestinians fulfill their desire to exercise their right to self-determination. Guess who votes against that resolution year after year?
Israel and the United States.
Who are the rejectionists?
It is, and it's absolutely unconscionable, especially the United States. For, and again, this goes back to our previous, conversation where we talked about the education system, but it is unconscionable that the United States, that its founding document is exactly that we have the right of self-determination. We get to decide who is our leader. We get to decide how our government is run. And if it's not working for us, we have the right and duty to throw off that government. That the United States does not allow that same right to the Palestinians is unconscionable.
Yes. Very well said. It is unconscionable.
Well, it's so obvious. It's so obvious.
This is the root cause of the conflict. The root cause of the conflict is the rejection of Palestinian self-determination. If we ever want to see an end to the conflict, this rejectionism must cease. They have to be allowed to exercise their fundamental human rights.
Absolutely. 100%.
And it's manifestly not the Palestinians who are denying fundamental human rights to the people of Israel. It's vice versa.
And if they're given and I say given, they have those rights, but if they're allowed to exercise those rights, and they decide through the exercise of those rights to put on violence against people, Jewish people and Zionists in Israel, I will be the first to condemn them. And I'll be the first to say that is wrong. And I'll be the first to say we need to do something about that. But until they're allowed to exercise those rights, it's like we have no moral justification to be doing what we're doing and for Israel to be doing certainly what it's doing.
Well, so that brings us back to the question of, the one state versus two states. And so my former thinking was, implement the two-state solution, which is essentially Israeli withdrawal, ending the occupation, not just withdrawal, but ending the occupation. Okay, so not just like what happened in Gaza in 2005.
Right.
Ending the occupation.
They can have an airport. They can have control over their international waters.
They can fish their territorial waters.
Right.
They can trade with other countries freely. They can engage in diplomacy with other countries freely, and enter into treaties with other countries freely. They can have exercise the national right to self-defense, which is another condition of Israel's when they're in their generous offers. Oh, and coming back to that point about the use of the term concessions. So I want to wrap that point up so that whenever you see, that Israel has made concessions to the Palestinians throughout the peace process, such as Camp David, for example. Well, what that means is that Israel was willing to accept less than what it wants. So that's considered an Israeli concession, which of course is a ridiculous, absurd framework for analysis. The proper framework is, again, what are both parties entitled to under international law?
Right.
And basic common sense and just
and negotiating skills, right? Property rights.
Exactly. So it looked at under the proper framework of what each party was entitled to. The only concessions ever made, always and ever, came from the Palestinian side, starting with the Palestinian acceptance of the two-state solution, which was calling for a Palestinian state on just 22% of the former territory of Palestine. That's a major concession, and it wasn't enough for the Israelis, who had already, as a result of the 1948 war, had already taken over 78% of Palestine through ethnic cleansing, which was considerably more territory than even the inequitable, absurdly prejudicial UN partition plan had suggested for the Jewish state. But it's not enough for the Zionists. It's never enough. They want more. Essentially, what the Zionists want is all of the land in Palestine without the Palestinians. hence the ethnic cleansing in 1948, hence the genocide in Gaza to this that's happening right now. And one of the more positive developments, to look at the light at the end of the tunnel and reason for hope, is that the government of South Africa, bless it,
Yeah.
has filed an application with the International Court of Justice charging Israel with the crime of genocide.
Good.
And we've
Wow.
seen since that happened, was it a week or two ago? It was just quite recently. I wrote an article about it. Um, and we have seen Israel actually, since that happened, since that application was filed, Israel actually pulled out some of its forces. And I just saw a New York Times headline today, haven't read the article yet, but saying that Israel has announced that it is going to start drawing down its operation and starting to pull back. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think Israel knows that it is really in big trouble legally, because
Yeah.
I think Israel must recognize that it will not be able to defend itself against this charge at the International Court of Justice, both because of the openly declared, and you can read the application, it's quite long. It's a few hundred pages long, but it's very well documented. It's very well done. I mean, I didn't read the whole thing very carefully, but I did read at least the first half or three quarters or so pretty quickly, and then I kind of scanned the rest of it
Right.
just for sake of time. It was quite long before I wrote the article about it. But like for example, they detail statement after statement after statement of like openly genocidal intent from Israeli leaders. And so, given the openly declared intent,
Right.
coupled with what's actually happened on the ground, where you can see that is what actually has been put into operational execution on the
Right.
ground. I mean, I don't see how you could possibly argue that it doesn't meet the definition of genocide under international law. I don't know how you could defend against that. And I think Israel realizes it can't defend against it. And also, so this does a number of things. Number one, it puts pressure on the Israeli government. It puts pressure on the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is a separate body in The Hague. So the ICJ makes legal determinations, essentially, the International Court of Justice, sometimes known as the World Court. It issues advisory opinions. It basically makes legal determinations. It's basically the highest authority in the world in terms of how do we interpret international law? What does international law allow and what does it prohibit? That's the ICJ. Another relevant court decision, it was in 2004. The ICJ issued a ruling at the request of the General Assembly of the UN, determining that the wall, that the annexation wall, essentially, that Israel was building in the West Bank was illegal, along with the settlement regime, is a violation of international law. So that was the ICJ in 2004. And so this also puts pressure on the ICC, which is, again, a separate body, which actually prosecutes. It has the authority to prosecute individuals, high-level officials that perpetrate war crimes. And so this puts pressure on the ICC to advance its investigation. It does have an open investigation since 2014 into war crimes committed both by Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas, and the Israeli government. And so this puts additional pressure on the ICC to move forward with investigating the genocide in Gaza. It also, of course, puts pressure on the U.S. government to put pressure on the Israeli government to start winding things up, wrapping it up, and ending this, because this slaughter just can't go on. And it's putting the U.S. in a dangerous position because the U.S. itself is in violation of the Genocide Convention. This is important because the U.S. itself is violating the Genocide Convention, because the Genocide Convention actually, to which the U.S. is a party and Israel is a party, it it places an obligation on parties to the convention to prevent the crime of genocide. And here you have a situation, not only is the US not prevented it, it has facilitated it. It has been absolutely complicit in Israel's perpetration of this genocide. So you have a situation where Biden and top US government officials could be prosecuted for the crime of genocide.
Man.
Now, whether or not that's going to happen,
So say we all.
I would be skeptical it might go that far.
Sure.
But certainly,
But
certainly, it
undermines
theoretically could happen.
it, or it strengthens the point that you made earlier, that the reason why Israel doesn't level Gaza today is there is a certain amount of political pressure that disallows them to do it. And the more pressure, whether that's internationally through South Africa and the UN courts, or here, and this is kind of how I think of it, man. If one or two people who watch the discussion that we're having today changes their mind or decides to look into or rethinks that, as I did recently, rethink their position on Israel and even that kind of pressure, from a grassroots level, it makes a difference. It makes a difference. And so I totally commend the work that you're doing and appreciate it, man. It's important.
It makes a difference. It's incredibly important because if you think about it, what needs to happen if there is going to be a just peace at some point in the future, where there's peaceful coexistence in the Middle East between the Jewish people of Israel and the Arab people of Palestine, it's going to require, as a first step, an end to U.S. government support for Israel's crimes against Palestinians. As long as the U.S. government support for this persists, there's just no possibility for a peaceful resolution. It's just not possible. It's not logical possibility. And so U.S. government support must end. That's a first step. So how do we get there? And once that happens, then we can talk about, okay, where do we go next?
Exactly.
What has to happen next? But it's kind of pointless to even have that kind of theoretical academic discussion as long as the U.S. government support continues.
And that
so
only
who
happens.
Is it up to for this to end? Who is it up to? It's up to you. It's up to me. It's up to us. And so it's incredibly important for people to become educated about this topic, to learn to recognize what's true, what's not, what's propaganda, what's real, what's historically factual, and what's historical myth and propagandistic lies, and then to speak out, because it's up to us to really, there has to be a paradigm shift where it becomes politically infeasible for the U.S. government to continue its policy. And that's up to us. I mean, there's nobody else is going to do that. It's up to us to achieve that. And so, what you said is incredibly important. If just one or two people have a change of thinking and kind of have that paradigm shift as a result, well, that's something. That's an achievement.
Yeah.
And we can all work toward in whatever, I have certain skills and talents that I try to put to use. Other people have different skills and talents. And so, but as long as we're each applying our own unique abilities and insights and whatever it might be towards the goal of liberty, justice, equality.
That's right.
The idea that you have this Jewish supremacist state
openly.
Exists. Yes,
hey,
openly.
I'm happy to be called a fascist.
No, because openly, because we were talking about nation states and the whole problem with the institution of statehood earlier in our discussion. So let's bring it back to that. You have what's called the Jewish nation state law. I think it was 2019, became part of the basic law, which is Israel doesn't have a constitution, but has what's called basic law.
Okay.
So the Jewish nation state law literally defines. It says that the right to self-determination in the territory under Israel's control, which of course includes the West Bank and Gaza, although Israel hasn't officially annexed those territories, but Israel, and this is why it's been called an apartheid state by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem and Gisha, UN agencies, UN reports, investigations. They're all calling it an apartheid regime precisely because this fiction of an independent state of Palestine, it doesn't exist because Israel controls all of the territory between the river and the sea. And so this apartheid regime. So the Jewish nation state law defines the right to self-determination is an exclusive right of Jews in Israel. An exclusive right of Jews. So it's an openly Jewish supremacist state.
Yeah.
Openly, unabashedly, and unashamedly. And so is this something like, we live in the 21st century. We're supposed to be civilized, right? And yet you have people like ardently supporting this supremacist state that exists because of ethnic cleansing, that has continued, and at the entire 75 years of its existence has persisted and perpetually violating, systematically violating the human rights, the fundamental human rights of the Palestinian people. How can this go on? We're supposed to be civilized. So unless people awaken to the reality that like this state is really not like, it's not, I mean, people have this kind of like religious devotion to the idea of Israel as a state, and people have to get past that. I was raised Christian. Like I grew up in an environment of like hearing all the time, like the U.S. must support Israel no matter what. Because there's this belief that the creation of Israel was like this fulfillment of prophecy. But you look at what Zionists were saying. I mean, sorry, not Zionists, but you look at what like Orthodox Jews thought about Zionism when when it came into inception. They were against it. Why? Because they saw it as heretical. They saw it as heretical because they believed that they were supposed to await the Messiah. Because of course, Orthodox Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah like Christians do. This is the fundamental division between Christians and Jews, that Jews don't recognize Jesus, Yeshua. They don't believe they don't recognize Yeshua as HaMashiach, the Messiah, the Christ.
Yeah, the chosen one. Yeah.
And so they're still awaiting the prophesied Messiah. And so the Orthodox Jews at the time looked at Zionism, and they thought it was heretical because it was a movement of secular. It was a secular political movement, an act by rebellious men to defy God's will and try to reestablish the state of Israel on their own without God and without awaiting the Messiah. So it was totally heretical.
It's a Tower of Babel situation. Like we're not going to have faith that God is going to, allow this to happen. We are going to take it upon ourselves. I mean, it is. Anybody who reads the Tower of Babel, that's what that's about. It's the hubris of man overstepping the will of God. And
among Christian Zionists, you always hear, well, God gave the land to the Jews in the Bible. God gave the land to the Hebrews. Yeah. Of course, the tribe of Israel, there was one of the 12 tribes was the tribe of Judah, which is where Jews come from. The word Jew comes from the name of the tribe Judah.
Right.
So they were Judeans. But it's really like, if you read the Bible, at one point in my life, I actually I just sat down and I read the Bible from cover to cover because, in church, growing up, you go to Sunday school and things, and you're always taking these little excerpts, and they have some sermon about this little excerpt, and it's all out of context, and there's just like no context. But like I just cover to cover, just read it cover to cover. It's really hard to miss this whole idea of the what Christians refer to as the Old Covenant in the Hebrew Tanakh, which is the Old Testament. It's really hard to miss the central theme of how God established this covenant with the Israelites, and how they repeatedly throughout all their generations violated the covenant.
Right.
So that's what the whole Old Testament is a story about.
And the whole idea that land is tied to Israel is 100%. That covenant is predicated on their obedience, and until they're obedient, they don't receive the blessings of that covenant. And I don't think obedience is, ethically cleansing a people off their land. I mean, I just don't find that in the 10 Commandments.
Precisely. And you read, when the kingdom of Israel in the Bible, again, we're not talking about archaeology here, but the kind of the fabled kingdom, united kingdom of Israel was divided into two, and you had Israel in the north, and then Judea, the kingdom of Judah in the south, which was the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. the other 10 tribes were in the north. And then there was the Assyrian exile, where the Assyrian Empire conquered that northern kingdom. And
Yeah.
we read about, in the prophets, how that's described in the Bible. It's like, well, God issued a certificate of divorce with the kingdom
Right.
of Israel for their sins.
Right.
That's how it's described in the prophets.
And by the way, and if you're a Christian, like that becomes a new covenant and a new marriage with Christ as the husband, and with
Yes.
and all those blessings have flow into those who believe.
Right. Yeah. The idea that a literal, geographic
Right.
territory, a state known as Israel, like that's the fulfillment of prophecy, is really antithetical to the entire concept of the New Testament and the
Yeah.
New Covenant. But yeah, you still have Christian Zionists believing this, and then the same thing happened with Judah, the southern kingdom, with the Babylonian exile, where you can read again in the books of the prophets how that's described as, well, you were repeatedly warned that the land is going to vomit you out, and I'm going to hand it over to your enemies if you continue to violate my laws
Yep.
and violate the covenant. And so, like, I don't know how Christians miss that part of the Bible. Like, I just don't know. I don't get it.
Well,
Anyway,
by the way, I
but
think
my
that's
point being, here, I'm not trying
phenomenon.
to. Yeah, I don't mean to offend anyone who has religious beliefs. I'm just saying, like, okay, well, if we're going to look at this like from a biblical point of view, from a religious point of view, if we're going to do that, well, then let's be honest about what the Bible says. First of all, as a starting point, okay. And so, the point I'm making is that, so there's this really intense. It's that wall I was talking about when I was trying to speak out against the Iraq War, the forthcoming war in Iraq, and how what I was saying didn't conform with their belief system in how they believed that the U.S. government would never lie to start a war. They just couldn't come to accept that could be true. It just didn't conform with their belief about what the nature of the U.S. government. And so what I'm saying is, I get the point I'm getting at is that we have confirmation biases that we need to overcome. So I guess there are many people who kind of have a religious fervor in their devotion to the state of Israel, but I don't consider myself. Of course, I'm called anti-Israel for criticizing the government of Israel, just like I've been stupidly accused of anti-Semitism for criticizing the state of Israel. But I don't consider my position to be anti-Israel at all. I mean, I'm not. The writings that I have when I speak out in favor of peace and an end to violence, I'm not. It's yes, it's pro-Palestinian in the sense that I am an advocate of Palestinians' fundamental human rights, but I'm also an advocate of the equal fundamental human rights of the people living in Israel and of Jews. So I just advocating equality here. So it's not about being pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. It's about being pro-humanity and pro-human rights. And it's just that simple. And if we can overcome our prejudices and biases and just take a sober, honest look at the situation. I mean, so if you are religious, if you consider yourself a Christian, well, okay, what did Jesus teach? And how do we just apply those teachings to the situations? And I can, you could try to argue this point with me, but I don't see how it would be that if Jesus were here with us on earth today, that he'd be supporting this. That he would be supporting what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians, because it's completely contrary to his teachings. And so, to all the people who are listening and were watching this, who have those kind of the preconceived beliefs about what Israel is and the nature of the Israeli state that might be tied to religious beliefs and things, I think it's just time to do a reassessment and a reevaluation, and to really take a hard look, because we have to affect that paradigm shift. Because and Christian Zionism, I think, is the biggest reason. We can talk about the Israel lobby and its influence, but the bigger influence in my assessment is Christian Zionism.
Oh, that's the leverage. That's the leverage.
Overcome.
and I think
obstacle.
Yeah, and I think any Christian from any denomination, from Catholicism to Baptist to LDS, to anybody who proclaims Jesus as their Lord and as Christ, there are lots and lots and lots of examples of people in your community and people that you would see as authority figures in your community that are that would accept the premise, shall we say, that what is happening to the Palestinian people is not right, and that Israel, and that Israel is not the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Let me just say it that way. You can find lots of examples. So if you just
The
look,
Pope has described Israel's operation as terrorism.
yeah,
Okay, it's okay to criticize
it's okay,
the
right?
crimes of the Israeli government.
Yep. You know what? And Jeremy, you've been incredibly generous with your time, and sincerely, I really appreciate the time. I have just one more kind of question. I want to, if you don't mind, I want to take just maybe a step up a level, take a kind of big picture view. We're here in the beginning of 2024. We've gone through some crazy times. 2023 was a wild time, and I don't mean specifically from January 1 to December 31st, but kind of that like the Monet of the year, if you will, has been wild, from the end of COVID to Ukraine to what's happening now to an election that's coming up. Can you take a step back, and from your perspective, what are some of the lessons, or what are some of the things that you've learned that we've learned that we can kind of take into this new year? Maybe give us some thoughts on that as we finish up.
Yeah, well, I mean, the lesson of COVID is this. It's very similar to the lesson of Iraq. The government lies. And it lies to advance agendas that have nothing to do with the pretext. So we have with the COVID lockdowns, which were completely unscientific. Of course, they'd like to declare that they were following the science. That was a lie. And of course, the proclaimed benefits of the lockdown regimes never manifested in the data. And it was also very patently true that the end game of the lockdowns was coerced mass vaccination. This was apparent from the very beginning of the lockdowns. You can go back to the Imperial College model report that they put out in mid-March that the UK government and the US government and other governments around the world cited as essentially their justification for implementing these lockdown policies. And they said right in there, contrary to how the media reported it, that it was just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That wasn't what that model called for at all. It wasn't two weeks to flatten the curve. It was continued lockdown measures until a vaccine could be developed and rolled out and mass manufactured and rolled out. And then, of course, the logical corollary of that would be that people would need to be coerced into getting the vaccine if they weren't willing to do it voluntarily and freely, which, of course, we're talking about an experimental vaccine here. And people remember until August 2021, the vaccines were being administered under emergency use authorization, which is a status, a category for under the FDA regulatory apparatus for experimental investigational products. They were experimental vaccines. And then you can make the argument that after the FDA approved them in August of, I believe it was August of 2021, before Pfizer received the first actual approval,
right,
licensure.
But even then,
I mean,
they were still operating under the same emergency. Am I right about that? Like it
was still an experimental vaccine by virtue of the fact that the trials were essentially ended. So you had the original trials where you had the experimental group who got the vaccine and the placebo control group that got a placebo shot. Well, that was ended after emergency use authorization was granted because the placebo group was vaccinated away. And so we never had data on what the long-term effects of these vaccines were. That data doesn't exist. And so essentially the experiment moved out of the clinical trials into the population. And so the entire population became subjects of a mass uncontrolled experiment without properly informed consent. That's what happened. That's the lesson. And fortunately, there has been a great awakening in terms of more people now recognize that the CDC is not a trustworthy agency. Because pre-COVID, I mean, if you criticize public vaccine policy, it's like
yeah.
you are some kind of conspiracy theorist or something.
Right.
Like you must be wearing a tinfoil hat kind of thing to be criticizing vaccine policy.
It was
What's
basically
wrong
a
with
you
you?
and RFK.
Yeah, but now, I mean, so this is a huge shift where it became like mainstream, part of the mainstream discourse. The lack of trustworthiness of the CDC became part of the mainstream discourse. That was a huge change. You had changes where suddenly like concepts like natural herd immunity um, became part of the mainstream discourse. There was all kinds of shifts in just public knowledge. The idea of cellular immunity as opposed to humoral immunity, which is the antibody response, but you also have T cells.
Right.
Right. And suddenly, after the vaccines were sold to people on the basis of the lie that 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine were going to confer durable sterilizing immunity and end the pandemic by conferring herd immunity, by preventing infection and transmission. It was all a lie. None of that was scientifically accurate information, but that's how they were sold to the public. Biden said it. The head of the CDC said it. Fauci said it. Deborah Birx said it. They were all claiming that was the effectiveness of the vaccines. That's what they were going to do. So 2 doses would be a pandemic over once we reach a high enough vaccination rate. That was the claim.
That was the claim.
Then they tried to gaslight us and convince us that never happened. They never made those claims. I mean, it's absurd the level of gaslighting we've been through. But this is the lesson for anyone who just has any kind of honesty with themselves. That's what happened. The government lied to try to get people to accept the vaccines. And when that didn't work, they relied on coercion with attempted mandates. The whole lockdown regime itself became the tool. Like, well, we can end the lockdowns once you're all vaccinated, so go get your shots so we can stop these lockdown measures. That was always explicit. Here in Michigan, that was an explicit policy of the governor. And so it was the lockdown madness always had coerced mass vaccination as its end game. And people just need to just take a step back and just for a moment, just think about that for a second, because you have a situation where they were purporting to act in the interest of public health. And this is, I'm not just talking about the CDC and the FDA and just the government agencies. I'm talking about the entire public health establishment. And when I say public health establishment, I'm talking about the insurance companies, the healthcare providers,
right?
Probably your doctor, if you're listening to this. You know what I mean? Like they were all in on this huge deception. Everyone. They were all lying. The entire public health establishment lied.
Yeah.
So who do they serve? They're not serving us. So I think this is the realization that people need to come to. And the CDC doesn't need to be reformed. It doesn't need to be given more money. It needs to be eliminated.
Yep.
We would be better off. I'm going to make a proposition. I posit that we would be better off without the CDC. I posit that we would be better off without the FDA. I posit that we would be better off without the USDA. All these government agencies, they don't exist for the purpose of looking out for our interests.
Yeah.
They serve big industries and private corporate interests. And so we need a system that does serve our interests. And guess what that's called? It's called a free market. But we don't have anything resembling a free market, and that's the problem.
And worst of all, in the health sector, I mean,
yes, and the level of medical tyranny that we witness. Case after case. I know people who were like forcibly vaccinated, like they got the vaccine against their will because they were forced to keep their jobs.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, and by the way,
stories.
I think also, you saw the pattern of, how you know how this control was implemented. It was never by law. It was by decree at best. It was by policy most of the time, and
Executive orders.
by executive orders, and it was enforced by the exact same police that we pay to protect our rights. And it's just it was such a clear opening of like, wait a sec, these people, maybe your neighbors and friends, but they're serving, as you said, they're serving the interests of not you.
Right.
And
Right. And so I think that's the big lesson
yeah,
from the whole COVID insanity. And yeah, and I think you look at the deaths. I think a lot of the deaths are, this gets into a big deep discussion that we probably don't have time for today. But
right,
just to
right,
touch on it, the lockdowns themselves caused massive deaths, and the treatments, the ventilators that people were put on, it wasn't the proper treatment, and that killed a lot of people. We don't know the vaccines death toll because we just don't have the data. But you have to consider that um, all vaccines, regardless, there's something called non-specific effects. So vaccines can have what are called specific effects, meaning, okay, so you get a measles vaccine and it prevents measles. So that's the specific intended effect of the vaccine. But vaccines can have non-specific effects. And a good example is the DTP vaccine, which all the studies show actually results in an increased rate of childhood mortality. And so we don't have data on, again, we don't have data on the long-term effects on mortality of these vaccines. You can look at the question of whether they prevent COVID or not. That's one question. And that's what all the studies look at.
right.
What's,
And
comparing,
they're dubious at best.
and it is observational data, not
Yeah,
randomized controlled trials, but they have because they moved the trial, the population became the trial subjects, so
yeah,
they only have observational data to rely on, which is notoriously bad for this purpose because of all the possibilities of selection biases, which we could get into, including one called healthy user bias or healthy vaccinee bias. Um, but essentially, you have a situation where the population became the guinea pigs, and we don't have data. You can look at, they have observational data looking at the vaccine's effect on COVID mortality, but that's not what we need to be asking. We need to be asking, what's their effect on all-cause mortality?
right,
And we don't have that data, so we
right.
don't know.
And everything, like, we have a lot of um circumstances or stories. We hear stories of grown men dying in the soccer field and young men having myocarditis and all these things. But because of how it happened, there is always going to be plausible deniability. And you and I and those who fought from the beginning, or who have come around, are going to be called conspiracy theorists. And you just want grandma and grandpa to die, when the fact is, it was purposely done so that we would not know what the problems were with these vaccines.
Well, and excess mortality. If you look at the data on excess mortality, which is just
Yeah,
the amount of deaths kind of above
yeah,
the anticipated numbers, essentially based on historical data from prior years. So excess deaths have continued, and it's not attributable to COVID.
no.
But there's still a problem. Still a problem
Oh,
of
all
excess
you have to do
deaths.
is look at insurance actuary tables. Those that they came out, what, 4 months ago, the new insurance actuary tables for, I can't remember which company, but they came out and they absolutely showed an excess death among young men. They absolutely showed, an increase of problems in young women. I mean, these are just, when money's on the line, and as far as insurance, I think those are the type of things that you can trust. You may not be able to specifically point it to the vaccine, but you can
Mhm.
say there's a problem.
Yeah, and another example of one of the many lies that were told. I mean, there's the big lie about the effectiveness of the vaccines,
Right.
but then there's all kinds of other lies. The lie that what we were told. The claim was that there's no possibility of the vaccine mRNA integrating into human DNA,
Right.
which was a non sequitur fallacy. I won't say
Uh-huh.
it's a lie, but it was a non sequitur fallacy. It was a conclusion that didn't follow from the premise, because there's a known phenomenon called reverse transcription, by which mRNA is converted into DNA, and then that DNA can potentially enter the cell nucleus and become integrated with the host DNA.
Right.
This is known. It's a known phenomenon, and in fact, a considerable amount of our own human DNA is viral in origin, precisely because of this phenomenon, this known phenomenon of reverse transcription. And so it was a logical fallacy, and kind of more recently, well, it's not recent now, but it's for some time it's been known that there's DNA contamination in the vaccines. So from the manufacturing process. So it isn't even needed now for reverse transcription to occur, because there is the plasmid DNA is contaminating the vaccines, and you have experts in the area of like cancer genomics and things like this. There was a guy who testified, an expert, I think he was a cancer genomics expert, who testified. I believe it was the Senate of South Carolina. I don't remember which state, but saying, like I've confirmed this report. Like I checked myself, and yes, the DNA is there. It's contaminating the vaccines, and yes, this is a major concern. There's concerns about, mutagenicity, carcinogenicity,
Well, and
the potential for cancer causing, as a result of potential genomic integration. You have studies looking at the persistence of spike proteins. So, of course, remember the mechanism by which the vaccines work. The mRNA enters the cells because it's encapsulated in the lipid nanoparticle, so it doesn't get broken down.
Right.
That's the purpose of the lipid nanoparticle. So it makes sure the mRNA doesn't get broken down before it can enter the cells to do its thing. So it enters the cells. It causes your cells to become factories to produce the spike protein of the original Wuhan strain of the spike protein. The spike protein of the original Wuhan strain, which of course was long extinct. And so you have studies showing persistence of spike protein in vaccinated people. At the longest time point I've seen was at 6 months later, when what we were told is that the mRNA breaks down within days, and the spike protein would also just disappear from the body. It would be eliminated maybe within a few weeks. Right. But at 6 months post-vaccination, people are still have spike protein.
And I will say,
so scientists looked at the question, like, why would that be? And the conclusion that they tended towards was genomic integration, that the mRNA integrated with the DNA, and so the cells are continuing to produce spike protein.
Right. Wow. And what makes, and to me, that reinforces, kind of what we see, what we observe, where we're seeing different ailments in different people that doesn't really make sense. In other words, I mean, I'm going to put it as kind of baseline as I can. It seems as if the spike protein or whatever is causing the harm, the damage, because that's what it does. It causes damage in the cell that allows the cell to create the cells necessary to fight off the disease. Well, if it's too persistent, it's going to go find the weakest cell. And if your weakest cell happens to be your heart, you're going to get myocarditis. If your weakest cell happens to be your ovaries, then you're going to have reproductive problems. And I think, I'm not sure if there's been a study on this, but to me, that makes sense of how that problem can lead to the really diverse and strange problems that we're seeing in people.
Because the spike protein is distributed throughout the body, and the spike protein by itself, without the whole virus, just the spike protein, is known since early on to be itself toxic. It is itself pathogenic by itself, without the whole virus. Just the spike protein is pathogenic. And this has been known. And of course, you read the propaganda from the state health departments and the CDC. Well, the spike protein is this harmless protein. Harmless, they call it. And that's a lie. They've known that's just another deliberate lie. I mean, you can go into the literature and read about how the spike protein on its own by itself is pathogenic and causes problems. And this because you have immune reactions to it, partly for this reason. And so when it migrates into organs, and you have immune attacks on your own cells, for example. I mean, this is the hypothesis for why the myocarditis occurs. There are known consequences, heart related, um, to the vaccines. That is admitted. It's uncontroversial, but you have all kinds of other possible biological effects that they just kind of write off and dismiss. But the biological plausibility is there, and of course, we just the data, again, without having like randomized placebo-controlled trials to actually determine what the long-term effects are. Just the plausible deniability, because it's just very, very hard to try to establish long-term effects, years afterward, if years, if not months, afterwards. But increasingly, the biological mechanisms are being shown, like the biological mechanisms for genomic integration have been established at this point, without the need even for reverse transcription of mRNA into DNA.
Yeah. So when we were getting recoded, it was being done from the start. Man.
Yeah.
Jeremy, listen, man, you have been, again, super generous. And by the way, please come on again, because this has been a lot of fun for me. And I've learned a lot. Fun is a weird word, I know, from the topics we've discussed, but I've enjoyed the conversation tremendously.
Same. Yeah. For a second time now, Mike, I've appreciated our discussion, and I also enjoy speaking with you. I'd be happy to come back on and continue our chat, because
there's lots to talk about. What's the best way if people want to support you? How would you like them to do that?
Head to my website, so jeremyrhammond.com. And while you're there, sign up for my newsletter just to make sure you stay updated with my work. And yeah, I'm completely reader funded, totally independent. The work I do, nobody pays me to do it. I don't have a wage or a salary. So I rely on my readers to support me. And so there's a donate button there. You can head to my donation page. If you want to financially contribute to the work that I do, it's there. But certainly, at least get on my mailing list and sign up for my newsletter to be able to stay updated with my stuff.
Fantastic. Jeremy Hammond, thanks for being on And If Love Remains.
Mike is gone.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
Gone but not forgotten.
First of 23 installments requested by Dr. Levitt. Trying to be in compliance here because we're taking him and that whole organization